Story 1. One of my favourite things to do, and probably should be a hobby and skill everyone takes on, is hunting. It's a useful skill that could save anyone's life in a pinch. And if you have spent as much time on this activity as I have, then you know that the best game appears at night, such as deer and wild boar. That's why I was out at 2 a.m. on this particular hunting trip. I live in a desert state, so I use my truck as my tent. Camping with goat heads and foxtails can be a downer on the whole experience. Wherever I park is my campsite. I set up a Dutch oven inside the cab to avoid a campfire and smells scaring away potential game. The truck itself keeps me warm enough that I don't feel the need to run the engine all night. Just keep it on for 10 minutes at a time to get the power or heating I need. I don't hike too far away from my truck to stake out a deer or elk. After a few hours of complete silence and plenty of patience, they usually wander right in front of me and I can take my shot, easily getting my kill. This particular night was no different. I usually leave my truck and settle far away enough that I can't see it with my naked eye anymore, but if I use my scope I can make it out in the distance. I laid on my belly beside a bush with my rifle propped up and a camouflage tarp on top of me. All I had to do was wait. But after waiting longer than 4 hours, no deer or boar had shown up. I decided I had waited long enough. If I was going to make any kills that night, I'd have to relocate. So, I gathered my things and hiked back to my truck. Something told me to check back towards the bush. I'm not sure what I expected to do. At this point, if I looked and saw a deer, I was too far from range to take that shot and get the kill. But I lifted my scope to my eye anyway, and looked around until I found the bush I had laid beside. Within seconds, I saw it. I wasn't sure what to make of it, and I'm still not quite sure what it was. But what I saw was definitely like nothing I'd seen before. At first, I thought it was a bear. It was walking around on all fours, similar to a bear. I watched it walk right up a hill and turn towards the very bush I had laid by for all those hours. When I got sight of its side, it looked less like a bear and more like a man. It had a human head and crouched on its hind legs as a human would. But its arms were also very lengthy, longer than a normal human's arms usually are. I watched as it swiped at the bush I had chosen to hunt next to, and it smelled some more. There was no doubt it picked up my scent. I watched as it threw its head back to the sky and opened its mouth. The sound I heard was of a woman screaming for help, that she was hurt, scared, lost, and needed help. And it was coming from the direction of my bush and this creature. I thought that this weird creature actually could just be an injured woman that needed help, that her odd movements and behavior were a result of her injuries. I could only see her black silhouette after all, so it was highly probable that my mind was playing tricks on me. So I tried to rationalize my fear and go to her. I couldn't leave an injured woman alone in the desert to die after all. I took a deep breath to calm myself, but that was enough noise to grab the creature's attention. It whipped its head and looked in my direction. That movement was enough proof for me that this creature was no human girl. Its eyes glowed in the dark like a mountain lion, and it smiled like a shark-toothed, creepy Cheshire cat. It started running for me in a way that reminded me of a cockroach. I dropped my scope immediately and leaped into my truck. My nerves made it difficult to grab the door and close it. I couldn't have closed it a second later. As soon as I did, I heard a thump against the side of my truck. I didn't take time to look. I was too scared anyway. I did my best to get the key in the ignition and turn on the truck. The sound of scraping only encouraged me to get out of there faster. As soon as I turned on the engine, I slammed the pedal to the floor and got out of there as quickly as I could. I didn't dare look in any other direction than straight ahead. I didn't stop until I made it home. I didn't even stop for gas. I let it run on fumes to get me home, very well knowing I'd have to call a buddy to bring me gas in order to drive it again. My heart pounded in my chest for hours. I stayed up under my covers as a grown man until exhaustion allowed me to pass out. I was almost too scared to look at my truck, scared the creature somehow hitched a ride. But luckily, I must have lost it in the desert. I questioned if maybe lack of sleep made me delusional, and if it was all in my head. But when I looked at my truck, there was a huge dent and large scratches that could have only been left from that thing as it slammed into the side of my truck. I never went hunting alone again, and I especially never went back to that same area to hunt again. Story 2. It had been following me for days. I can't acknowledge it out loud. I'm too worried that I didn't actually scare it away. I'm scared it'll hear me. That's why I'm writing all of this down here. If I don't get this out of my head, I feel like I'm going to go crazy. And I still have 2 days of travel to get back to civilization. I've never been much for journaling or any kind of writing, actually. I'm not exactly any kind of academic. The only reason I have this notebook is because I thought it would be good for kindling, in case I get stuck in the rain. Turns out, that's the least of my problems. I have to stay quiet. Even a scratch of the pencil on paper might be too loud. Hopefully I've wrapped myself in enough sleeping bags that it can't see the torchlight, if it's outside. God, I wish there was reception out here. Anyway, I guess I'll start at the beginning. I need to document all of this so that I remember the details when the adrenaline wears off. Otherwise, I have a feeling I'm going to try to convince myself that none of this happened, and it was all just some crazy hallucination. I have to document all of this before too much time passes. And just in case I don't make it out of here, maybe they'll find this note with my body, if there's anything left of it, and realize that it didn't just die in a hunting accident. If you're reading this note, please do, but get out of the woods first and don't make any noise. I'm on a hunting trip. Let's start there. I do this all the time, but usually not alone, and I've never hunted in this part of the country before. I know, you should never go hunting alone. Firstly, I have Baxter with me, and while he might not be a person, he is great company. With that in mind, I don't really consider myself to be truly alone. Also, I'm usually pretty savvy in the outdoors, and I haven't run into a situation in the wilderness before that I didn't feel confident handling. I had no reason to believe that this trip would be any different. A few of my friends told me that there was great deer shooting around these parts, and I am nothing if not a sucker for venison. I'd had a terrible week at work, and to be honest, some meditative time alone in the forest sounded exactly like what I needed. Just me, my dog, and my gun. The first night was fine. The sky was clear and beautiful, and I could hear the owls calling in the distance, leaving the city as a distant memory. Only one strange thing happened that night, and I only realized that it was strange in hindsight. There was an echo. I was talking to my dog as we set up camp, blanketed by the dark, and I heard my own voice gently whisper back through the forest. Listen, I know echoes can happen naturally, and at the time I thought nothing of it. I imagined that the dense trees had caused some sort of reflection of the sound waves. Anyway, like I said, I thought nothing of it. I slept through the night, but I kept having these weird dreams. They felt different from normal nightmares somehow. I can't describe it. Maybe I'm just reading too much into it. I don't know. It was nightmare after nightmare, flashing so quickly that my brain almost couldn't keep up. But every single one of those nightmares I was running through the forest at night completely naked. My bare feet were getting scratched on the twigs, and I can still remember the pain. But I didn't care. I just kept running. I didn't even know what I was running towards. The only thing I knew was that I was ravenously hungry. Day 2 went by slowly because I was so groggy from 8 hours of incredibly unrestful sleep. I covered less ground than I wanted to, and what's more, I didn't see any deer. Not a single one. There were browsing signs and hoofprints all around, but it was dead silent. Not even the rustle of a deer passing by. I thought about just turning around and going back home then, as it obviously wasn't as good hunting as I'd been told. I'm not a quitter, so I pushed through. My God, I wish I was more of a quitter. From now on, I promise I'm going to quit as many things as I possibly can. No more persevering for me if this is how it turns out. It was on the second night that things went terribly wrong. I woke up to the sound of Bax growling. He's a hunt away, and he can be pretty scrappy, especially if something's nearby that wants to chase him. But it's not like him to wake me up. I wouldn't let him sleep in the tent with me if he did that. I reached out to pet him and murmured, "Go back to sleep, buddy." But it didn't seem to calm him. His ears were pinned right back and all his teeth were bared. He had his eyes fixed on one specific spot, almost in the distance, like he could see right through the wall of the tent. He growled again. I've never heard him sound like that. "Go back to sleep, buddy," I said, except pure cold shot through me, straight to the bone. Because I didn't say anything. It was my exact voice, my tone, even my exact words from seconds ago. But I hadn't opened my mouth. The sound had come from outside the tent, almost right where Baxter was looking. Baxter bared his teeth again and I held him close to me, all my bravado gone. It felt like a dream. I mean, I've never experienced anything like it in real life. I desperately wanted to wake up, but I could feel the racing of my heart, the cold of the night air, the weight of Baxter on my leg. If it was a dream, it wasn't like any dream I've ever had. It was Baxter's growl this time. Or more precisely, it was the exact copy of Baxter's growl coming from outside the tent. I fumbled in my bag, desperate, until I found my gun. The whole time Baxter was losing his mind with fear and aggression, but he didn't move from where he sat. I flicked off the gun safely. I also pulled out the emergency flares that I never imagined having to use, which was difficult to coordinate because at that point I was shaking like a leaf. "I have a gun," I yelled, as if that would change anything. Almost before the words had left my mouth, there was a response, even louder and closer than before. "Go back to sleep, buddy." That was it. My heart was thundering in my ears and I was so panicked that I could hardly even see. I ripped open the tent door and blindly fired into the dark. There was the sound of stumbling and twigs cracking. I fired again and shakily set off the flares. Except instead of sending it up into the sky, I sent it sideways, right to where I thought the thing was. I was willing to risk a wildfire if I could get Bax and I out of this nightmare. The bursting of the flare lit everything up into silhouettes and shadows. The trees, rocks, and sky were suddenly visible, and so was the thing that stood in front of them right next to the tent. I've tried so hard to put it into words so that I can tell my own brain what I saw, and to try and rationalize it somehow, but I can't even do that. Describing it on paper feels even harder. It's like I said, I'm not exactly a writer, but I'll do my best. What I saw filled me to the brim with a horrible sense of wrong. That's the most important thing to understand, but the hardest part to explain. What stood in front of me was a deer, but not a deer. No, it was a deer, but worse. That's a better description. A worse deer. It wasn't terrifying because of how big it was. It wasn't foaming at the mouth, nothing like that. It was actually pretty small, with no antlers, around the size of a normal doe, complete with 4 cloven hooves and soft ears. But it wasn't a normal doe. I could tell that much immediately. I've seen a lot of deer in my life, but I'd be willing to bet that even someone who had never seen a deer in person would be able to tell that this wasn't one. It looked like a deer had fallen apart and tried to put itself back together. The joints were just... they weren't right. The angles, the size of each joint, the texture of the fur. It was all slightly off, just by a fraction and put together in one creature. It was horrifying. The eyes seemed too deep in their sockets somehow. I sent another flare directly at it, aiming to cause as much damage as I could, and watched as its sparks collided with the patchy fur right in the square of the thing's shoulder. It stumbled back again, and I felt a sick satisfaction at seeing it falter. I shouldered my gun and aimed, shooting to kill. I know it wouldn't have killed it. I wouldn't be that lucky. But I get 2 shots in, one to the side of the neck and one to the shoulders. The impact didn't seem to affect it as much as I would have liked, but I still saw the muscles shake with the force of the bullets. It filled me with a small sense of satisfaction. What happened next is what terrified me the most. I can't stop thinking about it. Every time I close my eyes, I see those few seconds play over and over again. That whole time, which felt like hours but must have been only a few minutes, I'd been standing there looking at this thing, trying to figure out why it scared me so much. Outside of the whole mimicking my voice thing, which was obviously terrifying, there was a much more frightening aspect that I couldn't quite pinpoint. Seconds after my bullets hit it, it changed. It realized that the deception hadn't worked. It stopped trying to convince me that it was a deer. That had been the thing that made it so wrong compared to a normal deer. A normal deer doesn't care if you think it's a deer or not. It doesn't know anyone is perceiving it. It just existed. Whereas this thing, the wrong deer, it was putting on a performance. It was trying to convince me that it was just a deer, hoping that I would fall for it and let my guard down. After I shot it, it slowly graunched its 2 front legs off the ground until it stood on its hind quarters. From this angle, I could see a barreled chest slightly too concave, jutting in all the wrong places. It looked at me with those 2 deep eyes, and it screamed. It screamed in the voice of a man. "Help! Help me, please! Oh God, Cheryl, it's catching up!" Before it was cut off by a sick gurgling. It screamed in the voice of a woman next. No words, just high-pitched and visceral. The screams got louder and louder until finally, that same gurgling noise cut it off. The gurgling continued for far too long before it was silent. Standing there, frozen in place, I heard voice after voice, replaying, each meeting an ugly and wet-sounding end. I remembered the pitch-perfect copy of my voice that had come from the wrong deer just a few minutes ago. It had been indistinguishable from my tone, and it repeated exactly what I'd said, word for word. A mimic. This thing was a mimic, repeating sounds it had already heard. I felt my whole body go ice cold, like my bones had frozen inside of me. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The wrong deer looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "I have a gun. Go back to sleep, buddy." It was like it was reminding me of the point it had just made. All the screams were real. They had been real people, and now they were likely dead, and the creature in front of me had been the reason they were screaming. It had killed them, and it wanted to kill me. I need to take a break from writing for a moment. I thought I'd be able to get it all down on paper quickly, but it's taking me longer than I thought. My body feels like it freezes every time I think about the creature too hard. I need to breathe for a few minutes. Okay, I'm back. I took some deep breaths as quietly as I could, and it calmed me down a bit. My hands are still shaking. I hope this isn't too messy to read. Anyway, where was I? Somehow the paralyzing fear faded into a desperate burst of adrenaline that I am absolutely sure saved my life. It was the sort of adrenaline that makes mothers able to lift cars off of their children. That full-blown outburst of sudden power. I'm sure in that moment I could have lifted a car, but I didn't need to. I just needed to fire my gun. So that is what I did. I fired again and again and again. Blood that was slightly the wrong color leaked from the holes. It looked thick, almost like tar. As I shot, the wrong deer took a few steps backwards away from me, without breaking eye contact with me. I felt like I had finally made some ground, but I didn't stop shooting. Finally, the creature turned tail and fled. The way it ran through the bush, it almost looked like a puppet, stumbling into trees and fighting for control of its limbs. I lost sight of it pretty quickly, but I could have sworn that those horrible hind limbs elongated as it staggered away into the undergrowth. That was last night. After it left, I got back into my tent and sat there, silent and hugging my gun, until the sun had fully risen. Then I packed up as quickly as possible and got on my way. I haven't slept a wink since. I'm too scared to travel at night in case I run into it again. So I'm just sitting in my tent, silent. As soon as dawn comes, I'll be packed up and moving as fast as I can. I think I can get into town by tomorrow, if I'm almost running the whole time. I'm going to report this as soon as I can, but who knows if anyone will believe me. I know I wouldn't have believed me if you told me this story a week ago. I don't believe in monsters. I've never been superstitious. Even writing this down, I feel crazy. I'm going to stop writing now. I've gotten all the important details down, although I can't imagine forgetting this anytime soon. I can tell Baxter knows something is horribly wrong. Usually, I have to keep him on a leash while I'm hunting, but he hasn't left my side or made a sound since. I haven't seen his tail wagging at all, and usually he's wagging like crazy any time we're out in nature together. I'm so glad it didn't get him, but I'm keeping him close, and I'd never forgive myself if I let that happen. He's on my knee while I'm writing this, and he's shaking like a leaf. I haven't seen or heard any sign of the wrong deer since I shot it, but I can't shake the feeling that only I saw it because it wanted me to. I know it knows my face. I know it knows my voice. And most of all, I know it's hungry. Story 3. There are things out there that are not normal. Things that are weird, creepy, downright terrifying. Things that haunt your dreams. Things that stay with you for as long as you live. I know this because I have seen such a thing. Something that I, to this day, cannot explain. And I really don't like talking about it. Because just thinking about it sends shivers down my spine. But I guess if the creature or whatever that was is still out there, people should know about it. So, it happened back when I was in college. This was years and years ago, back in 2008. 14 years ago. God, it feels like a lifetime. So like I said, I was in college back then and the stress of the workload was getting to me. So when summer rolled around, I decided to take a break. My uncle had this cabin up in the woods by Lake Michigan, and it's just this beautiful place. It's really wonderful, or at least it used to be, and he takes his kids there all the time. So that year I decided to go with them. I'd originally planned to stay for about 2 weeks, but I ended up leaving on the 6th day. You see, for the first couple of days it was awesome. The place was so beautiful and calm, it was everything I needed. We went fishing, hiking, birdwatching. You know, the usual. We even spent a night camping outside. It was perfect. And then on the 5th day, things got creepy real quick. You see, we decided to go birdwatching that morning. And trust me when I say this, after looking for hours, we couldn't find anything. Not a single bird. In fact, nothing. No animals, no sounds, nothing. The woods were so quiet it was unsettling. So we decided to go fishing in the lake, and we couldn't get a single bite. Something had spooked the fish. My uncle had been going up there for 10 years. He told me he'd never seen anything like that. So by round 2, we decided to call it a day and went back to the cabin. So a couple of hours later, by around 4, maybe 5, I guess, we realized Kelly was not in the house. Kelly was my uncle's dog. She was wonderful. So we called for her and looked for her around the house, and by about 6, we started to get worried. I mean, God knows where she is and what she's doing, and by about 7 we start to panic. So we all picked up torches and my uncle grabbed a shotgun, because there's all sorts of wild animals out there, and we went out to look for her. Believe me when I tell you there was nothing out there. These woods were silent. And a little further up the trail we found something that, well, still makes me want to puke. It was an animal carcass, or whatever was left of it, because that thing had been ripped to shreds. Its insides were scattered everywhere. It was horrible. At first we thought it was done by a mountain lion, but my uncle said, no cougar did this, and it hasn't been eaten. Whatever did this must have been crazy. The thing was so badly mutilated that we couldn't even tell what it was. So we moved on, hoping whatever did that didn't get to Kelly. We'd gotten a little further when my uncle suggested that we split up, which was a terrible idea, but I didn't want to say that because it'd make me seem like a coward. So I split up from the others and went deeper into the woods, and at this point, I was already pretty freaked out by the carnage that we'd seen. So almost as soon as I left the others, I was hit by this strange cold feeling that constantly ran up and down my back. And there was this smell, this horrible putrid smell that made me want to puke. It was so bad that I had to cover my nose just to stop myself from passing out. And that's when I heard that godforsaken sound. It still rings in my ears. It was like this clicking noise, and it kept getting louder and louder. And every time I heard it, the chill I was feeling got worse and worse, until I was shivering. And then, there it was. I can never forget that thing. I saw these 2 spheres, almost glowing red, emerge from the foliage. The moment I saw them, I was petrified. I couldn't move a muscle. And then, that thing moved. And I saw it. Its body was like a skeleton. I could see its bones and the skin. It was grey or black. I don't even know what the colour was. And the worst part is, that thing looked almost human. It was on all 4s, but it slowly got up. And I realised it was huge, over 7 feet tall. And then I saw its face, those horrible red eyes, and that mouth. There was no skin around its mouth, and those teeth, that thing was a nightmare. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find my voice. I felt like my soul had left my body. That thing moved towards me, and just then I heard a gunshot. And so did the thing, because it disappeared in a flash like it was never there. I stood there in that opening for God knows how long until my cousin found me and practically carried me back to the cabin. It was a good few hours before I came back to my senses, and they told me that my uncle had fired that shot to let everyone know he'd found Kelly. She'd been scared half to death by something. My uncle said it must have been a bear, but I knew it was no bear. I didn't tell anyone about that thing I'd seen because, well, I thought they'd think I was crazy. But I know what I saw. To this day, every time I close my eyes, I see that abomination. Before I continue to the next video, I just want to say a huge thank you to all of my followers for helping me to get to 100,000 subscribers. I made this video just for you. I know at the time of releasing this video I'm only at around 99,000, but I'm so close and it's only a matter of time, I thought I'd treat you all sooner. If you're new to my channel and are interested in creepy stories delivered in a storytelling style, please subscribe for more content. Story 4. I have never been one to stand out. In school, I was the kid at the back of the class whose name the teachers wouldn't even remember at the end of the school year. The kid that was all too regularly asked if they were new or a transfer student. Half the kids in my class wouldn't notice I was there if I was slapping their face with a wet sock. I'm fairly sure most of my teachers just thought up a random grade at the end of my class to at least put down something for me. And honestly, it never went too badly for me. They never had any reason to give me bad grades, never had anything against me. It was a calm life. I was content being invisible. I was content not being remembered. Maybe more so now than I used to be back then. The looks were funny. The confusion when they realized I stood behind them. The unspoken question, so clear on their faces, wondering if I had been there all along. The frown, frantically trying to remember a name or a time that we had interacted, and people just couldn't. Would play along most of the time, because it was so important to them that they were in good standing, that they remembered, and were remembered. I was never really lonely despite all this. I had my select few friends, mostly ones that I knew from my childhood, ones that stood by me, had my back, and I could have theirs. But you know that we wouldn't be here if none of that ever changed. I wouldn't be here. Now, the looks are different, and maybe, sometimes, I wish myself back to those times, to the times when no one really knew anything about me. But when your girlfriend's death becomes the talk of the town, so do you. I met her in high school, in the time I was still no one, still invisible. Now Kelly was actually new to the school. She was new to the town, even if her parents weren't. They had just decided, on a whim, to move back to the town they grew up in. Maybe it was because they remembered the school, how big it was, how easy it was to get to. Maybe because they remembered the good times they had there. Maybe because they wanted to save the wreck of a marriage they were in by drowning themselves in fake memories. It's one of the better choices you can make, I always thought. Better than trying to fix the cracks by stuffing them with more kids. She was bright. Not only in the intelligence sense, but also in the way that she seemed to glow when she entered a scene. How the clouds seemed to make room for the sun to shine. How the light just buzzed a little brighter, as if she were overcharging the bulbs. She was the kind you wouldn't forget, because the light left an imprint like staring directly at the sun, a shape left over where you stood just a moment ago, but while you were trying to lock it down, it disappears, and you find yourself missing something. No one ever asked for her name after the first time she arrived, and she never asked for mine. The first time she saw me, it seemed like we knew each other, with that look on her face, that look of recognition. The way her eyes lit up, and everything else stopped mattering. I wondered all too often how I deserved her, how I deserved her friendship at first, and how I deserved her yes when I finally got the guts to ask her out. She was mine all throughout high school. I was less invisible, And more, in a way. With the glowing sun at my side, no one would bother to look at the scrawny, quiet kid. But when I was alone, they remembered my name. When I was alone, I was the person who scored big and no one could understand how. If nothing else, they knew that about me. We went to a college in driving distance, chose it together because it was most convenient to both of us, being able to stay in a place we knew for a little while longer, not having to pay for college housing. She settled for me. I always knew she did. She could have gone to better colleges, could have gone to Europe, to wherever she wanted. She stayed because of me. I never hated myself more for anything. A year ago, maybe a little longer, I've lost track of time since, she took an opportunity. We talked about it for a long time, but it was never a decision I should have had a say in. An internship across the country, up in Wisconsin. It was in her field, the kind of job she would gush over when she allowed herself to dream. I still remember the day she left. The day her parents almost didn't let me pick her up to bring her to the airport because they weren't sure how I knew her. But she came out of the house packed with too many bags and a bright grin on her face, and she kissed me before she twirled around to get her bags in the car. She was so excited. Seeing her leave hurt. Seeing her giddy and happy over being away from me, knowing that she wouldn't see me in something close to half a year. It was hard to stay positive, to stay supportive when the thought was always nagging in the back of my brain. The thought of forgetting, the way that people worked, how they saw things and people differently from a distance. But I couldn't bring myself to ask, to beg her to change her mind when her expression turned uncertain at the airport. The brightness crumbled, and the tears in her eyes scared over what she might be leaving behind. It seems ridiculous now that I was worried about being forgotten, when now I'm pretty sure I never will be again. We did well in our time being long distance. We talked every day, texted whenever we had time or thought about each other. I got pictures of her, selfies, pictures with new friends I briefly got to know over video chats every day. And then, they stopped. Everything. No texts, no calls, no pictures. And mine didn't seem to get through to her. Like a light had been switched off. I'm fairly sure that the sun darkened the same day. That it started out dimmed, and I only noticed when the lack of contact became obvious. My parents tried to tell me that maybe she needed a little bit of time to herself. My friends joked about her having forgotten about me, helpful as they were. But I was starting to get the feeling that they were right. I was forgotten, left behind and lost, like I had been used for so long. It posed much harder, now that I'd seen how different life could be. But after a couple of days, after a week, I went by her parents' house. Someone must have heard of her. If not me, if not our friends, her parents at least. I knew they hadn't when I saw the police just outside their door. When I saw her mother breaking down into tears and her father barely holding it together. She had been on a camping trip, they said. Out, to find a sense of calm when her job became stressful. It was supposed to be a weekend out. One night, under the stars, surrounded by nature, trees and fresh air. Just them and a couple of tents up in the mountains. No schoolwork, no internship, no boss and no work. A fun trip. That her friends had come back from without her. I haven't been to the college since. I couldn't stand being in those same classrooms that I saw at her side. Couldn't stand sitting around in the libraries that we studied in. She was everywhere. The imprint of her light burnt into my retinas. And now, I couldn't get rid of it. Eyes drawn to me everywhere I went. The pitiful glances of my peers when I could still bring myself to go to school. the questioning looks cast my way, wondering what had happened to her. While she was still considered missing, while no one knew, and still everyone knew that she was dead. They watched me with the same pity they considered her mother with when she was taking herself through town, showing pictures of her daughter that everyone knew, in hopes of getting a word, a hint, someone who had seen her. And every time, people had to tell her the same thing, that they hadn't seen her, that they didn't know, that they couldn't help. I got the whole front of it, lingering glances, whispers hidden behind their hands as if that would make me not notice them. Touches to my shoulder as they passed, hands subtly stroking over my shoulder that were intended to be comforting. I grew so sick of it. Every look a stab to my gut, every whisper more fuel to the fire, every touch a slap in the face that brought her shape back into my sight. The remnants of her light, but none of her warmth. Strangers as much as friends. My parents, when I came downstairs for dinner. It's funny when you think about it, that the more people remembered me, the lonelier I became. The more alone I was, the more I wanted to be. But other than them, I was never wallowing in the loss of her. I never lost myself. There was something more to it, more to her, more to whatever happened where she disappeared. And I couldn't keep sitting on it for the rest of my life. I got her address over there from one of the friends she met. One of the ones I actually got a word in with on one of our video calls. They hadn't rented it to anyone else, with her having paid ahead of time for her entire planned stay. It was less of a hassle, less problematic than having to deal with new tenants when the time was paid for anyways. They weren't particularly happy about letting me stay, but they did. Her things were still there. Her parents hadn't had the time yet to come and pick everything up. Or the strength. And honestly, seeing how much the place looked like her, how much of her light was still left behind, and the way that she made her bed, the top of her duvet always folded back into a triangle to form an inviting gap showing the sheets beneath, and the way everything was organized, drawers for everything, each item that couldn't be recognized immediately labeled. I couldn't bring myself to change anything either. It smelled like her, the apartment, a hint of her shampoo still hanging in the air, her perfume still present when I lay down in her bed. There was the temptation to stay where she last was, because here the imprint of light was most prominent. Sitting at her desk over her homework she always worked over with a smile, standing in the kitchen humming along as she cooked up her favourite meal. But I had other plans, and I wouldn't let a fleeting image, a ghost from the past, keep me down. So, the next morning I set out for the woods. The keys to her rental were still on the dresser by the door, with the pink fluffy heart-shaped pendant that I gave to her before she left still attached to its ring. I couldn't help pushing it through my hand on the way out to the car. I couldn't help reaching for it again and again while I was driving, as if the last of her light would rub off on me just as I held it long enough. I watched townscapes turn into fields, fields turn into forests the further up I drove. And all the way I could still see the way they looked at me, her friends when I asked them for the coordinates of where they set up camp. So pitiful. I saying everything words no longer dare to with how much I must have heard them already. How sorry they were, how horrible it must be, whether I was doing all right. Would I be here if I was? Would I go out searching for someone who should be dead? If not then by now, with how long she had been left up there. The GPS yelled out its instructions to turn seconds before the narrow side road came up. I wasn't paying much attention, jerked out of thought with a sudden call and pulled the steering wheel around just as suddenly. A barely asphalted road right into the forest, something flashing up in the corner of my eye, too quick for me to do anything in time. I still hit the brakes, but the car didn't stop until it hit whatever jumped out in front. I felt my heart racing, could see the deer flung across the road halfway back into the forest, where a tree gave it the rest of what the car didn't. It was folded around the trunk, its side burst open. The tree painted red, so much more blood than I would have ever believed a deer would have. Spread across the hood of the car, sprinkled over the windshield, over the crack it had left behind, seeping down into its fur and into the ground. It was still twitching, nothing that you would see of a living animal, but the last jolt of electricity sent through that of a dead one. My stomach turned at the sight. I debated calling someone. Police, animal services, anything. My eyes moved back to the road, to the point where it turned into gravel, just a couple of feet further in, and the bend that hid the way that led further up the mountain. I had other things to do. A dead deer in the forest where it wouldn't get in anyone's way wasn't one of them. The crunching of gravel underneath the tires of the car was oddly familiar. Trees close on either side of the road, leaving barely enough space to avoid anything coming down from the mountain. I couldn't help but look back again, but the deer and the specks of blood disappeared behind the next bend, along with the way back onto the main road. The trees stood densely, their crowns leaning into each other so tightly they obscured the sky completely, drank up the light of day, and left nothing for whatever crawled around on the forest floor. The further I drove up, the tighter they seemed to shuffle together. The deeper I got, the less light came through to light up the road I was driving on. A couple of minutes in, I had to turn on the headlights to see it all. Another few minutes, and even that didn't seem to help much anymore. Every time I turned my head to look out of the window, the darkness seemed to creep in closer, hungering for her light, for the imprint she'd left behind. The pin in my location app was still a good bit out when the road began narrowing down. Trees reached further down now, a thick wall of wood forming on either side of the car. A glance into the forest beyond was more occasional, a gap in between the trees that the dark seemed to almost ooze out of. They were flying by much faster than they should be, gone before I could get a better look at them. The car was going on its own, turning the bends before I even moved my hands, accelerating even if I barely touched the gas. The dials were spinning out, leaving me no clue of how fast I was actually going. Another gap flew by and the darkness opened up, just for a second, to show something of a face in between the trees. Gone before I could get a better look at it. I lifted my foot off the gas, but the car kept going. It flashed up in the corner of my eyes, the pitch black and the dots right in its center. Red orbs, like eyes. How near or far they were, I couldn't tell. My stomach twisted awfully, whether from the speed or the still narrowing path ahead, or the darkness that seemed to close it off behind me. Everything. I reached for the pendant on her keys, closed my hand around it. Wetness squeezed through my fingers, sticky and warm. I let go with a yelp, looked down to see the pink fluff soaked in red and my fingers stained the same. It was closer this time with the next gap, eyes wide open fixed on me, and I could feel them still, after I had passed it. An icy cold that bore into the back of my neck, ran down my back and sent a shiver through my entire body. I couldn't shake the feeling, couldn't shake the need to glance out of the windows here and there, always expecting something, anything, but always being met with the same forest I had been driving in, the same wall of wood, of bark, the same dark fog obscuring everything that should be behind it. I shook my head, reached up to the steering wheel again, but it still turned without my doing and wouldn't when I tried. I cursed, slammed my foot on the brake, but nothing happened. A click, as if the brittle mechanism finally snapped in two. My heart was beating out of my chest, the pounding so loud in my ears it drowned out the constant clacking of the gravel kicked up against the underside of the car. A foul smell came through the vents, slowly, but I only noticed it when it was too late to do anything about it. I had known it before, sometime, when the cat brought something back and hid it, and we didn't find it until it started rotting. It was the same smell that it gave off when it was bloated and looked like it was about to explode if you were to touch it. While on the drive towards the forest, I couldn't get the pitiful eyes of Kelly's friends out of my head. Now, it was their faces, fallen in, greyed skin, torn open over their cheekbones, empty swollen eyes, a black liquid spilling from their lips whenever they opened them. Something that used to be blood running down across their chins and staining their throats. The trees began to peel themselves, bark stripped off to show dead wood underneath, filled with maggots, insects, finding a home in the decay. Yellow, foamy mold lining the edges of torn holes. I saw it coming up this time. The gap. My eyes fixed on it, determined to see something. Now. I turned my head with it as we passed. It was her face in the darkness, her eyes staring back into mine. But her light was missing. The colour drained from her cheeks, the depths of her pupils dull and blind. Her mouth hung open, but there was no sound. Her scream swallowed by the forest. And before she could try again, a hand wrapped around her skull, long pointy fingers digging into her skin, into the side of her mouth, and yanking her back into the dark with it. The next beat of my heart finally burst my eardrums. The world went quiet. My heartbeat only a feeling, threatening to burst my throat open as well. But the pain made me turn my head again, just in time to see the end of the road ahead, coming down so narrow that the car wouldn't fit anymore, or be torn in half at the speed that I was going. And then, right at the point where the road got too narrow, the headlights caught that shape again in the darkness. The deer stood staring straight at me, unmoving and unwilling to. My foot found the brake again, forgetting that it stopped working before, slammed down, once, twice, while I cried out, cursed and couldn't hear a word I said. I reached out for the handbrake, yanked it up as hard as I could. I felt the screech more than I heard it as the car finally slowed, scraping along with the speed it still had. It drifted to the side, turned, and then came to a stop. The stop jerked me sideways, a sharp pain in my temple, and everything went black. It scraped along the side of the car, a metallic screech, like a key dragged through the lacquer. Fingers, something tapping along the metal, trying to find a way in as it fiddled with the handles, but couldn't get a good enough grip on them for the locks to spring open. Weeping, the soft cry of a woman. She sounded desperate, in pain. A whispered please mixed in between her sobs. It was quiet though when I opened my eyes. Dark, but different from the kind that had chased me. It was the dark of the night. The silvery light of the moon and the stars from up above piercing through the blanket of leaves over the forest. The headlights of the car were still on, one side flickering, their warm light flooding the forest ahead. I blinked, reached out more blind than anything else for the floor on my side, cracked it open. The cold night air washed over me instantly. But instead of the fresh forest smell I was expecting, there was a dull sense of rot hanging in the air. Sickeningly warm and sweet, a scent I wouldn't get out of my nose for days. The front of the car was dented in pretty heavily, some damage that animal had done. left behind more blood than I had thought. Bits of fur still stuck in the grill of the car. It flashed before my eyes again, the carcass and the shadow that had caused me to break so hard. It was a horrible moment once it was over, a horrible thought once it had passed. But even after, I couldn't deny that it had been there. The urge to move to the front of the car, fall onto my knees at the grill and lick every bit of blood from the metal. The urge to drive back to feast on what I had left behind, bury my fingers into still, warm, maggot-crawling flesh, rip out what my hands would let me, and stuff my face with raw meat. The voice in my head telling me how nice it would be to feel the blood on my skin, silky, smooth blood, warm still from the heart that had been pumping it through the animal's body that hadn't stopped too far back. I was hungry. It told me I was, and I could feel it. The nauseating pull in my center, the emptiness that ached to be filled, the whisper so close in my ear, my own thoughts. To feel the flesh break between my teeth, grind it down, swallow it whole. More and more, I still couldn't take any more. And then, another handful. I stopped before I could touch the car, with a ding from my phone indicating that the coordinates I had put in weren't that far anymore. But as I turned away from the corpse, I could feel an incredible hunger gnawing in my stomach. There were still imprints in the foliage where they had set up their tents, the ground still disturbed, as if nothing had moved past it since. The makeshift campfire in its centre still stood, a small, burnt-down stack of wood surrounded by a circle of stones for containment. My phone dinged. The metallic voice from my pocket announced that I had reached my destination. I ignored it. Instead, moved to gather a bit of wood. I could feel the cold in my bones, an icy pain running through my body. A fire was my best shout. I gathered everything together, threw the twigs and branches I had found onto the old pile. The brittle wood coal fell to ashes when the new layer of wood came down on it. I still had a box of matches in my pocket. Looking at them, it didn't seem like one would be enough. Looking at them, I should light them all. Throw them all into the fire, all at once, or one by one. No, I needed them all now, right away. Use them before anyone else would. Even if there was no one around me that could steal them from my hand. I gathered the bunch in my fist, held them pressed tight together. Their heads flared up bright like the sun, blinding me for a moment. The bunch formed a single flame rising up into the sky and burning down towards my hand just as quickly. A stray spark hit my skin and I let go instinctively more than anything else. They split apart the second the pressure of my hands didn't pass them together anymore. Fire rained down, half of it hitting the foliage between my feet, and I scrambled to stomp it down. The other half fell into the fireplace, eating up the layer of dry leaves, the smaller twigs I had scattered on top, and finally, down into the bigger pieces of wood. Flames licked up into the air, lit up the clearing, fell over the flattened spots spread around the campfire, and on the face that sat across from me. A grimace, hollow cheeks, a mouth wide open, eyes rolled back, if they were even there, rather than empty sockets staring back at me. Cheekbones almost poking out through the skin, sore and still not reactive enough. A flicker of the flame, a shadow fell over the face, and it was gone. Quick enough to make me wonder whether it had ever even been there. The heat did its best to bite away the cold, but it still stuck to my fingertips, burning as it fought its stay. There was a whisper. It became clearer the longer I listened to the crackle of the fire. Sizzling, popping sounds that seemed to only be there to fill the silence. A language made to sound like English, while I couldn't understand a single word. But I did understand what it wanted of me. What I wanted. My fingers dug into the earth they were resting on, filled my hands with dirt, with foliage and twigs and the sticks left over from the matches. It was better than I'd imagined. Slimier. The bitter flavors. Something twitched on my tongue in between the ground that I had stuffed into my mouth. The whispering roared up, spurred me on, and I took another mouthful. A voice, somewhere through the sound, through the hissing and the wet smacking from my own lips. A word so distant and yet close enough for me to recognize it as one. I swallowed. The mass was rough and hard, hurt as it went down my throat, but I didn't have enough. As I lifted another handful of dirt up to my mouth, a worm wiggling between my fingers, I heard her voice, the bark of my name, the echo rolling through the woods. Blake! I stopped. The campfire was oddly still. I don't know whether it was that moment that I realized how still the air was, how stale, or if it had happened earlier. I swallowed down the rest that filled my mouth, rose to my feet, searching the empty woods. Blake! She was crying, desperate and helpless. I took off, rushed past the fire, past its room of influence into the darkness that the forest brought. She called, again and again, her voice so clear and still not getting closer. I could barely see anything. The light still burned into my eyes. Something crunched beneath my feet, the feeling of snow, squeezed down by the weight of my step. It was summer, but with the cold that surrounded me, it didn't seem too unlikely. Kelly, I barked back into the darkness. I could still taste the bitter leaves on my tongue, could still feel the grain of dirt and sand in between my teeth. And then there she was, sitting against a tree, her head leaned back against it. She looked at me, her eyes glistening in the dim dark. I could feel my heart sink, the weight falling off me, because I had found her, found what I came here for, and now I could take her back with me. Kelly, sighing out in relief. But it got colder with every step I took towards her. The rotting smell that filled the forest before becoming more and more apparent again. She reached out her hand, and I stretched out mine, wrapping my fingers around hers. I'll get you home. Her skin was so soft. It had always been one of the things I loved about her most. Then, it was too soft. Her flesh giving to the pressure of my grip, bones slipping away into each other as her skin melted away. I could see more now in the dark. Could see the torn clothes on her body, ripped fabric barely hanging off her skin. The skin, bloated, distorting her shape enough to make her nearly unrecognizable. Gashes on her chest. What I could see glistening in the dark had never been her eyes. It was the blood that was still wet. The blood covering her ribs when flesh and skin didn't anymore. Maggots, scavengers crawling through her rotting, fallen flesh. Her face wasn't hers anymore. Not that once brought light. Not that I once stared at for hours. There were no eyes in her sockets, only a black goo running down her cheeks like tears. And then I heard her voice again, whispering my name. But it didn't come from her open mouth, nor the gaping hole in the middle of her face. It cracked when it moved, every bone aching and forcing itself to unfold. And that's when it came visible to me. The face behind the tree, long and just as fallen in as hers. Dead eyes, filled with writhing maggots. It rose up, further and further, foul-smelling, black saliva dripping from its open mouth. The shape stood twice as tall as me when it finally stopped, thin, not more than skin and bone, claws wrapping around the tree. Its mouth fell open and Kelly's voice called out my name again. I don't remember taking off. I just remember running. I remember a light in the distance. I remember heavy steps behind me. The campfire had almost died down when I got back to it. I didn't stop to reignite it, only dared to take a breath when I had finally slammed the door behind me. When I looked back, there was nothing in the woods. But I didn't stay to find out whether it would still show up. I thought about sending the police back up there, to find her, to bring her mother peace and knowing she wasn't lost somewhere at least. But how could I live with myself if someone else was left behind never to be heard from again? So I stuck with the keychain from the car keys, attached them to mine. It would have to be enough. Story 5. I'm not crazy. I always have to say that. Every time I tell someone what I saw, they give me this look. They don't call me crazy. They just say things. Things like, maybe it was your mind playing tricks. Or, maybe you're hallucinating. But I can see it in their eyes. What they really mean is, you're out of your mind. But I know what I saw. You hear me? I know what I saw. It has been 5 years now, but it's still as clear as it was the day it happened. Maybe I should start from the beginning. Like I said, it was 5 years ago. It was 2017, during spring break, when I and a couple of friends decided to do something different. Unlike every other undergrad who went on spring break, we wanted to do something more than just going to a beach and getting drunk. So, when one of us, Matt, suggested to spend a week at his brother's place up in Washington, we all jumped to the idea. It would be fun, we thought, to spend some time with nature out in the woods. So we all packed up, rented a car and set out. It was a small town, a couple of miles south of Seattle, and Matt's brother had a little cottage just outside of the main town, a bit into the woods. The place was beautiful. The boys went bowling, hunting, hiking. They were having the time of their lives. But the moment I stepped out of the car, I knew something was off. Something was wrong with that town, with those woods. I'd be lying if I said I didn't have fun. The first couple of days were awesome. But things started to go downhill real fast. It all started when Max, one of us, said he wanted to go out for a walk. And despite his brother, Matt, telling him he needed to take someone along, he decided to go alone. At the time, we all thought nothing of it. Max was a big dude. He could handle himself pretty well. So we just let him go out, alone. He came back about an hour later. He burst through the door rambling about having seen a demon and that there was something evil in the woods. We all need to get out of here, he kept shouting, and that the white demon was coming for us all. After about 10 minutes of screaming and hyperventilating, he fainted. Matt, his brother, and the other guys decided to take him to the hospital. Myself and another dude, Rick, decided to stay behind, so that we could hold the fort. Before they left, Matt advised us to stay inside. Suffice to say, we didn't listen. Just about 5 minutes after they were gone, Rick got up and said he wanted to go and look for this white demon, and I decided to tag along. We stepped outside and went into the woods, and almost instantly we both knew something was wrong. The entire forest felt like it was dead, like it was holding its breath or something. It was a clear night and the moon was bright, but the trees were so dense that we could barely see anything. We walked along the trail for a while, and then at some point, Rick just stopped. "We should go further into the woods," he said. I told him that was insane, but he didn't listen and started moving quickly towards the trees. Obviously, I followed, but I could not keep his pace. Rick was fast, and pretty soon I lost sight of him. And that's when I felt it. That feeling of hopelessness. I couldn't move, and every hair on my body was standing up. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was watching me. I could feel it. It felt like the temperature suddenly dropped significantly. I was shivering. Then came the smell. It was the most horrible, rancid and putrid smell I had ever smelt. It didn't just make me want to puke. It made me want to rip my nose off. It was so bad it felt like it burned my nostrils as it went in. I've had years to think about what that smell was, and the closest I have gotten to is the smell of rotting flesh. I could hear something moving in the bushes to my left, and every instinct, every primal part of my brain told me to run. It told me I was going to die if I didn't. I have never run from a fight my entire life, but that day, I couldn't run even if I wanted to. Something was holding on to me. It was fear. I was so afraid that my own body betrayed me. It was like I had been petrified. I heard the thing moving closer, coming towards me, and against every instinct telling me not to, I turned to look at it. As soon as I did, I wish I hadn't. That thing was a nightmare. It was a horror that cannot be explained. But I'll try. It was huge, almost 9 feet tall, and as white as milk. It was no more than a skeleton so thin it looked starved. Its flesh was rotting and the bone was visible in many parts. Its arms were abnormally long and its fingers were like the legs of a spider. They moved in a blood-curdling rhythm. It made a noise. It sounded like click, click, click. And it got louder, and it moved closer. It took every single ounce of courage to move my eyes up to its face. It was the face of pure evil. It was rotten and deformed and had a mouth full of rows of razor-sharp, pitch-black teeth. And the worst part was the eyes. They were blood-red with slit pupils and burned with nothing but hunger. Looking at that thing and its eyes would have been more than enough to drive any man insane. It might have even driven me insane. As that unnatural abomination moved closer, I closed my eyes and made my peace with God. I knew that thing was going to kill me, but it didn't. I could feel it staring at me. God, I could even feel it breathe on my skin. I don't know what happened after that. I fainted, I think. The question that I continue to ask myself to this day is, why didn't it kill me? That thing let me live. It just left. When I opened my eyes, it was gone. Where or who it was, I never asked that question. I don't think I want to know. Rick said that he found me there, sitting on the forest floor, with my head between my knees. He said I wouldn't move or say anything, and that I didn't respond. But I don't remember any of that. All I remember is that for days, weeks after I saw that thing, I couldn't see anything else. It was like it was stuck in my brain, like its smell refused to leave my nose. 3 years of therapy and countless failed attempts at telling people about it later, and to this day I do not know why that monster did not just tear me apart. People say that it wasn't real, and a part of me wants to believe them. But then there's another part that remembers what it saw. The pale skin, the bloody eyes, and the spider-like fingers. It was an actual monster, a demon, Something unnatural. And then there's the fact that Max saw it too. Of course, Max lost his mind and spent the last 5 years in a mental asylum. But still, he saw it. I'll say it again. I am not crazy, and I know what I saw. Story 6. I find it very difficult to tell this story because it represents one of the worst days of my life. I used to go hunting with my dog Ron on a small reservation in Colorado. Ron was a mix of German Shepherd and Labrador. He was a very intelligent dog. I used to carry an air rifle and shoot down birds or rabbits, and Ron would look for them for me. One winter day, Ron and I were walking through the forest when, after a couple of hours, I noticed that the forest was silent. At first, I had not realized it, but normally one usually hears all kinds of natural sounds, some birds at the distance, branches rustling and all kinds of stuff. But that day, there was only silence. We moved a little further, when Ron began to growl and bark in the direction of some trees. I thought he had seen a rabbit or something like that, but there was nothing, although Ron seemed like he saw something there deep in the forest. "What's up, buddy?" I asked while I pet him to try and calm him down. Ron continued to growl and bark in the same direction, but he wasn't making the typical barking that a dog makes when it sees another dog and wants to establish dominance over it. This was like a nervous barking, almost as if it was mixed with crying. Ron continued like this for a few seconds, when I heard the creaking of branches and what seemed to be footsteps. "Anyone there?" I asked without receiving an answer. At that moment, I got distracted and released my grip on Ron's leash. He ran off towards the forest. It took me a while to react when I realized that Ron had already entered into the trees that were in front of us. I could hear him barking in the distance, getting further and further away, when suddenly I heard nothing, and what followed was a blood-curdling screech, the sound of a dog in pain. I ran immediately, calling for Ron, but I could no longer hear his barking. After a few minutes of running, I came to a clearing where I found a scene that marked me for life. There was Ron, on the ground. His body had been smashed. Best way I could describe it was as if something had taken him by the hind legs and by the front legs and pulled in opposite directions of each. He was torn in half. The whole floor was full of blood. His intestines spilled, and there were pieces of bone too. His face had an expression that I could describe as a mixture of pain and fear. I was in shock, more than by the blood and guts. It was from seeing my dog that I had raised since he was a puppy, dead on the forest floor as if it were a scene from a horror movie. I would like to say that this is the strangest part of this story, but it's not. Maybe it took a few minutes to contemplate the whole scene. Maybe it was more or maybe it was less, but for some reason, I decided to look up and look ahead. There, among the trees, I saw what at first I thought was a person. I say I thought that it was a person, because of the way its hands, if it could be called hands, were holding the tree it was hiding in. I could only see its face and part of its body, as if it was hiding, waiting for me to leave. I couldn't deduce how big it was, because half its body was behind the tree. Its hands were huge. At the end of his fingers there were what seemed to be very sharp claws. I managed to pick out that they were still covered in blood. Its face lacking of recognizable facial expressions. I could only see 2 black holes where its eyes should go. Its skin was pale, almost grey. I was so afraid that the only thing I could do was take the collar from Ron's corpse and run away. I don't know how long I was running, but I arrived at my truck and started driving. My first instinct was to call my family, but I was so scared that I couldn't dial the number on the phone. After a few hours of driving, I got to my parents' house, and I told them what happened. I showed them Ron's collar still stained in blood. My parents were very confused. They tried to calm me down by offering a logical explanation. My father told me that an adult bear is strong enough to rip off a man's head with a single blow, and with all its strength it would have no problem killing a dog. But I have seen bears in the wild, and I've never seen them do anything like this. Plus, if it had been a bear, it would have eaten my dog instead of just leaving it there. My father also told me that whatever I saw in the forest was probably just my imagination, a way to deal with the pain and shock of having found my dog in that way. Inside of me, I wanted to believe him, but I knew he was wrong. I had seen something in the forest, something that was not of this world, something that killed my dog, and maybe if I had stayed there any longer, it would have killed me too. For a long time I replayed the event of that day over and over again in my head. I'd wished I'd held the leash tighter, or that I should have shot that thing even though I only had buckshot. But worst of all, I felt like I had been a coward for abandoning Ron like that, and not to give him a decent burial. I never went back in the woods after that day. Story 7. I really don't like talking about this, at least not when I'm sober. Partly because when I'm drunk, people just assume that it's the alcohol talking. I know that no one actually believes me when I tell them what happened all those years ago, yet I still tell every person who's willing to listen. I don't know why I do that. Maybe I just want to find someone who will finally believe me, or maybe I just want to get it off my chest. I get the impression you want to listen, so I'll tell you. Let me start by telling you that sometimes one single event, one chance encounter with the unexplained can change your life forever. For me, this encounter came almost 20 years ago when I was just a kid in high school. High school. That time of our lives when we all have absolutely no idea what's going on or what we're doing, yet we still act like we've got it all covered. High school for me and most of my friends was the most boring part of our existence. So when the school announced that they were going to organise a 4-day camping trip at Camp Katrina up in the wild forest woods, we were the first ones to sign up. My friends and I didn't have much of a social life, but we all had a great love of the outdoors, and trips like these were what kept us going. Simon, one of the kids, was more excited than all of us. I mean, he practically wanted to move out to the woods. He was a cool kid, couldn't go 2 minutes without telling you some fact about trees or some rare animal. He was one of my only true friends. On the day we left for the camp, he sat next to me on the bus. He told me he'd made a list of all the things he wanted to do there. Rowing, telling scary stories around a campfire, mountain climbing. You know, things you do at a camp. He was beyond excited, and so was I. I was never really good at studying, but it was times like these when I shined. I was the fastest guy in my class and pretty good at climbing, so I got more than enough opportunity to take trips like these to impress the other kids and look cool. Camp Katrina was everything we had imagined and more. We had so much fun, and the counselors were the nicest people ever. One of them, David, even taught me how to start a campfire and set up a tent. He was the coolest. The whole trip went perfectly. We rode, fished, climbed, and had a bonfire. Nothing went wrong until the last night. As long as I live, I will never forget that night. The things that happened, the things that I saw, and the things I could have done differently. We all went to sleep around 10. It was complete darkness in the woods once all the fires were put out, and we were all in our cabins. Our bus was supposed to leave early in the morning. Sometime during the night, I don't remember what time it was, Simon woke me up and told me that he wanted to go out into the woods for one last hike. He said he wanted to feel the feeling of roaming in the wild freely one more time before going back to his ordinary life. I wanted to protest. I told him there could be wild animals out there. But he had me beat. He said that there were no animals big enough to be dangerous in those parts. Eventually, I gave up. We both got dressed and quietly sneaked out of the cabin. We took the main trail into the woods. There was a full moon that night that lit up the entire forest like a giant light bulb. We must have spent hours out there, just wandering around, taking in the beauty of the place. We must have been out there for at least 3 hours before we made a bone-chilling discovery, the first of many. Wandering through the woods, we came to a clearing, in the middle of which lay an animal carcass. As we moved closer, it looked like it was a deer, or what was left of it at least. Almost all of the flesh was gone from the poor animal's body. Only bones and some impressions of skin remained. I was horrified by the state of that corpse, that it consumed my mind about who or what could have done such a thing. Simon, on the other hand, was just fascinated. The blood was fresh, he declared. Whatever had done this must have been close. When I suggested it might have been a bear, he said the claw marks on the thing were too big to be from a bear. I told him we should just get back to camp. And that was when we heard it. Something was moving in the trees. Something big. It was breaking twigs and branches as it circled around us. I was scared within an inch of my life, and even Simon had started to sweat. I turned my flashlight towards the trees from where the noise was coming, and there it was. I only caught a single glimpse of it, but I'll never forget what I saw. It was something that, by all means, should not have existed. It looked like an abnormally large and thin person with blood dripping from their mouth. And that mouth, it was the ugliest and scariest thing I'd ever seen. It had teeth and claws that looked like it could tear through solid metal. And its color, it was like snow. Before I could get a good look at that thing's eyes, Simon grabbed my hand and told me to run. I obeyed, gladly. I never in my life, before or after, have ever run as fast as I ran that day. But that abomination was chasing us. I could hear it. It was right behind us, tearing through the trees. Every time it made a noise, it was like something was drilling into my head. It drove me nuts, but I still kept running. I didn't look back, not even once until I reached the camp. And like I told you, I was fast. At some point I must have lost Simon and left him behind. May God forgive me for that. It was only after I'd gotten to the camp that I realized he wasn't with me. I panicked. I had no idea what to do, so I woke up the camp counselors and all the teachers and told them that Simon was out there. I also told them that he wasn't alone, that a monster was out there with him. But of course, they didn't believe me. They told me to stay in the cabin and went out to look for him. They came back late in the morning, without him. Though one of them had found his glasses. For months they sent search parties into those woods to look for him, but no one found him or any sign of him. Simon was never found. I'd heard that thing coming after us, and I'd heard Simon struggling to keep up with me, but I just kept running. Like a coward. It has been 18 years, and even today people assume he just got lost in the woods, fell off a cliff, drowned or just ran away. But I know the truth. That monster in those woods got to him, and it's all my fault. I could have saved him if we'd just stayed together. God, why didn't I just look back? Losing Simon to this thing is going to haunt me till the day I die. I don't know what that thing was, but I do know that it wasn't a person or an animal. It was something else entirely different, something evil and ancient. And it's still out there. Story 8. My name is Callie Juliet. I'm a weird 18-year-old teenager. Trust me when I say weird. I mean it. Not only am I weird, but also frustrated. My life is not the envy of many people. I won't blame them, though. I mean, I don't even like my life. I have been living with my grandparents since I lost my parents at the age of 10 in a car accident. And ever since then, I've lived my life like I was just existing. My grandparents had to keep taking me out of school, because the school would always complain of how I would sit dumb in class or how I would sit in the corner, staring strangely at every student that passed my way, scaring them off, or times when I would mumble incoherent words to myself, or how I would walk around shaking my head repeatedly, making everyone stay clear from me. I know you're wondering if I'm okay, but the truth is, I'm not. For years I've been battling with these voices in my head. I don't know who they are. I just know they have been the best friends I have never had. My grandparents have taken me to multiple psychologists the moments they noticed me talking and smiling to myself after my parents' death. But nothing happens. Nothing changes. Every time I look at my grandmother especially, I see this long face she puts on, this heavy heart she carries around, which I know it is because of me. I feel so sad, but I can't do anything about it. I don't understand myself. I don't know where my life is heading to. All I know is that either I'm possessed or I'm a different species of human entirely. Currently, school is on summer break, and it is usually my favorite time of the year, when I don't have to pretend to be like other kids, or explain to anybody why I was laughing all by myself. It is a big relief, honestly, but I guess my grandparents would prefer if I was in school. They believe me being around people would make me normal. That's why I had to go for a stroll immediately after breakfast today. I didn't want to see the sad look on my grandmother's face or hear the sorrowful tone in my grandfather's voice persuading me to join them in watching their favorite TV show. "Be careful out there, Callie," my grandmother called after me. Before I could respond, my grandfather chipped in. "Try to avoid the woods and don't be long," he said warningly. I will. Bye," I responded, shutting the door after me. The moment I stepped onto the pavement, I felt the cool breeze hit my face, savouring the texture of the wind against my face. It was a welcome feeling. I walked down the road, taking in the beautiful sight of nature. Strangely, I was happy to be out today instead of staying locked up in my room, which is my everyday routine. I pulled my phone from my pockets. Searching through my music list, I selected a playlist and inserted my earplugs. Yes, I forgot to tell you. Listening to music is one of the ways I use to escape the noises in my head and everyone and everything around me. I selected Look Into My Soul by Jay Jackson and I kept it on repeat, moving my head and whistling to the lyrics. I walked and walked, my mind on the little memories I could remember with my parents. Those times when I was a normal, happy child. I could remember those times when we would all sit on the big dining table, pray together and eat together, me sharing all the things I like and dislike about my friends in school, making Mum and Dad laugh, or those times Dad would carry me to bed and read me a story before I would go to sleep. My mum standing at the door watching us with a big smile on her face. These are just the memories. They are dead, and I won't ever see them again. I miss them so much, I thought, as a sob escaped my lips. I didn't know there were tears on my face until I tasted the saltiness on my tongue. Surprised, I reached up to wipe away the tears. And that was when I noticed my environment. The trees around me, the darkening of the sky, and the dried leaves on the ground. I quickly paused the music and pulled out my earplugs. The silence that came after was enough to deafen me. Shit, I cursed silently. Try to avoid the woods, were the words running through my head at that moment. How did I get here? I whispered to myself, looking widely around me. The woods were dangerous. Ever since we moved into the neighborhood, my grandparents have continuously said to me to always avoid the woods no matter what. I kept looking around, and funnily, it didn't look that dangerous to me. I continued walking silently, and yet I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, apart from the big fallen trees on the ground that could probably cause one an injury if you weren't looking. Maybe that was what they were scared of, me getting injured. I shrugged and continued on my way. I continued walking, enjoying the quietness of the environment until something happened, something I am not quite sure of. I felt something, or maybe someone, run past me, but I didn't see anyone. I stopped walking to look around, but nothing. I was the only one there. I shrugged again as I continued my walk, not even knowing where I was heading to. I hadn't taken up to 5 steps when I heard a strange sound. It was like a strangled cry. I panicked as I whirled around in searching of the source, but still couldn't find anybody. Maybe it's the voices in my head, I thought. But when the sky darkened and the cry came up again, I knew I wasn't alone. Now, I was scared. There were goosebumps all over my body. I turned back to where I was walking from and began to walk back faster. I needed to leave this place. I would have said I was hallucinating, but grandfather's voice kept playing in my head. Try to avoid the woods. I walked faster, my heart drumming hard against my ear. I didn't know where I was heading to. Everywhere was becoming darker, and I almost cried at that point. "Oh my God," I screamed as I saw something move in front of me. I couldn't see it clearly, but it was an indication I hadn't been alone for a while now. I didn't know if the realization should make me more scared or relieved that someone was with me. Anyway, I stopped walking and just stood. The object was coming closer. I still couldn't make out what it was because it got darker. "Hello?" I called out. No response. "Hello, is someone there?" I called out again. No response. It kept coming closer in a dramatic way, slowly. I didn't realize I was moving backwards until I hit the back of my leg against something. I cried out. It hurt badly. I turned around to check what I hit my leg against and saw it was a fallen tree. I bent down to rub my sore leg. For a second, I had forgotten about my predicament with an unknown object and my environment. It was then that I heard a strange hiss come very close to me. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head around and I almost fainted. My eyeballs were almost out of their sockets. My mouth was opened, but I couldn't even scream. It was as tall as a tree, its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash grey of death, and its eyes pushed deep back into their sockets. What lips it had were tattered and bloody. Its body was unclean and suffered from suppurations of the flesh, giving off a strange and eerie odour of decay and decomposition. I stood paralysed. Never in my life have I ever seen such an ugly, eerie creature. It raised its head and roared out, making me scream from my lungs. I turned around and started running as fast as my legs could carry me. I heard its heavy breathing behind me, but I refused to look back. I kept screaming as I ran fast. And boom, I fell down hard on the ground. Hissing in pain, I tried to get up, but I wasn't fast enough. The ugly creature with its bloody fingers grabbed one of my legs and pulled me up. I kicked wildly into the air, trying to pull out from its grabs. Screaming and kicking into the air, I saw my life flash through my eyes. The thoughts of my grandparents made me sob. Its fingers sunk deep into my flesh, making me scream in pain. I wanted to fight back. I was tired of everything, of my life, of the way everyone treated me, of the frustrating voices in my head. I stretched my hand for its head, struggling to get a hold onto something. Its fingers sunk deeper, making me wince in pain. I reached out for its eyes and plucked my fingers into them. It hissed out loud, breathing heavily. It held me tighter, bringing me closer to its mouth. I looked into the deep hole of its mouth, tears rolling from my eyes. I gathered all the strength I had in the world and punched it right in its face. It roared and released me immediately, but not before biting deep into my shoulder blade and dropping me hard to the floor. I managed to muster up the energy to get up and run. Perhaps the creature figured I was more trouble than it was worth, but I was able to run and get out of the woods without it following me. I vowed never to return there again. Story 9. I spent the first few nights of my holiday entirely alone. Growing tired of staring at the same four walls, I grabbed my cell phone and dialed the number of my best friend Sam. He laughed down the phone at my suggestion of a camping trip in late April, as the weather had been hit and miss. With the promises of me bringing a stash of alcohol, picking him up in an hour en route, and my all-weather tent, Sam finally agreed. I put down the phone and could hardly believe what I'd suggested either, given that my wall thermometer was barely reading in double figures. With a well-equipped Ford truck, I drove to him. He hovered in his doorway, muttering something under his breath about him being crazy to even agree to this. I suggested that we didn't drive for more than half an hour, and then carry our gear and supplies for a little while longer to set up camp. Clad in our all-weather walking boots and down-filled jackets, we followed the beaten track into the woods. Something felt off. I said absolutely nothing to Sam as he pointed out a rabbit warren. We paused for a moment, in case we could catch sight of the buck, but there was nothing. Only stillness. I patted his arm and told Sam that we should keep going, because it was heading towards 9 and neither of us had eaten. That was supposed to be all part of the fun, roasting sausages and potatoes wrapped in foil over the fire. Finally, we organized ourselves and found what seemed to be an ideal spot. We were both yawning a lot, and it wasn't exactly late. It was as if the quality of the air had changed, thickened almost, and I began to cough. I paused while I caught my breath again, and blamed the cold that I'd just recovered from. Finally, the tent pegs were sturdily in the ground. We decided to bring a 2-man tent because it made no sense to drag one each with us. God, it was getting so dark now. The fog was starting to come down, and with it came a horrible chill. I was glad that I'd shoved in an extra blanket. "What's that?" Sam pointed to the bizarre imprint in the soil just to the left of the tent. "Why would a horse come here?" I shrugged, not entirely sure that it was a horse's hoof. There wasn't exactly a clear line of them either, nor a trail. I figured that maybe that could have been down to the fact that they weren't fresh and the rain might have washed them away. Still, if it was a horse, it was a very random place for it to be. The cold was almost unbearable. I clutched my sugary tea with trembling fingers and chattering teeth. I'd promised him alcohol, but really that was the last thing on our minds. Still, a shot of vodka might have taken the edge off the bitterness. We both couldn't stop yawning, and the strange cough lingered in the back of our throats. We gave in. The flashlight was too intense for this time, and was stinging our eyes, so we decided to bed down for the night. Sam grumbled a few times about being freezing cold, until I offered him my spare beanie hat. He thanked me, shoved it over his frozen ears, and turned over onto his side. I didn't mind sharing a tent with Sam. He was like the brother I'd never had anyway, and he didn't snore much. Sam was still shivering a great deal. I asked him whether he was okay, and he only replied that he felt a tad off, but not unwell. I didn't exactly know what he meant, but at that point, I felt it would be better for both of us if we just tried to get some sleep. Sam groaned and placed a hand to his head, exclaiming that his head was spinning. I reassured him that maybe it was just a change in air pressure, and that I felt the same. Yeah? I gazed up, confused as he asked me why I'd called his name. I'd said nothing to him for the past 5 minutes. Then I heard a scream. Christ, what was that? Sam was bolt upright in his sleeping bag, clutching his knees in the darkness. Where was the torch? I fumbled around me. It was pitch black, and yet I daren't switch the damn thing on. In the distance, there was a slow crunching not too far away. Perhaps it was an injured deer, yet no way would a doe make that horrendous sound, even if it had been shot, and surely we would have heard a gun firing. Sam clung onto my arm with both of his hands, and I would have always said he was the bravest out of the two of us. What do we do now? He whispered. There's something moving out there. He asked me whether I saw what he did. Yes, but there was a shape moving in the distance, something tiptoeing and making a clopping sound, possibly an explanation for the hoof-like prints. My truck was only parked about half a mile away. With the light from both our torches, perhaps we could have ditched the tent and gotten the hell out of there, I remember thinking. I also recall us debating packing up quickly and making a run for it. We did just that, shoving our sleeping bags into our rucksacks and bundled up the tent. We poured the now cold kettle water over the dying fire. It was nearly impossible to see or tell where we were. There had been no signal whatsoever to track the exact location. Sam. 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 Our eyes widened. It was a voice, a distinctive human one. Was there someone playing some kind of sick joke? In the sheer rush, both of us had forgotten that the forest floor was dangerously slippy in places. There were roots everywhere, hidden under the clumps of leaves. Sam slipped and fell flat on his cheek with an almighty thud. Initially, I thought he'd been knocked out cold, but then I realized he was flopped onto his side. Staring, he reached out his shaking hand to point, and it's then that I saw the enormous shape stood next to the closest tree. There was a deep, throaty growl, and I knew in those few seconds we had to get the hell out of there. Sam winced in pain as I tried to haul him to his feet. A good friend might have shone their flashlight on the injury and prodded the joint to check for breakages, but I was only intent on leaving. "Ah, my foot!" Sam yelped as he tried to put his weight on it and staggered. I grabbed him and said that he'd either have to run or I'd leave him there. Cruelly, I made him walk, or rather hobble, with one arm around my neck and the other clutching my waist. His breathing was shallow and ragged, but we were nearing my truck. Thank God it was my vehicle. That thing was not going to get us, not on my watch. Sam groaned, his grip on me weakening. Finally, we made it back to the truck. Balancing him and fumbling with the door, I hauled it open and bundled him inside. "Tracks," he whispered through his colourless lips. I hadn't even noticed the fresh tracks which had stopped just a few feet from us. I shoved my foot onto the accelerator and sped out of the woods. I don't think it followed us, I muttered, teeth chattering as I gazed over to the side of me. Sam looked nonplussed, his skin reduced to a horrible ashen shade. "Hey Sam, your ankle might be broken, but I'm going to physically force you to put your weight on it and walk miles," he mimicked. Though he was his usual sarcastic self, his voice was feeble and breathy. I remember feeling like the worst human being. Then a wave of dread came over me. What if his ankle was broken? With great reluctance, I asked him, but he only shrugged at me and said, "Hopefully not." He was shaking horribly, and the only thing I could think of to say was to offer to drive him to the nearest accident and emergency. He point-blank refused. I pulled up outside my house, unlocked the door while ditching the stuff and helping him inside. I pulled open the sofa bed, my fingers numb, and fumbled with his left boot. There was an almighty lump just below his ankle bone, surrounded by an angry redness, which was beginning to turn blue and purple. It was a bad sprain, but not broken. Unlike both of our spirits. Story 10. It's been a few years since this happened, and with time some of the details have faded. I remember the important parts, sure, and the scariest parts. But I'm sure I won't tell the story anywhere near as well as I would have if I saw your advertisement 12 years ago when the memory was still fresh. I guess society has gotten a bit more accepting of people talking about these kinds of encounters since those days. I couldn't really talk about it right after it happened. Everyone would have thought I was insane, or just plain weird. Anyway, I'm glad you guys are doing this. It's a great initiative, and I'm sure it will gain a lot of traction. Hopefully, it'll take a weight off people's shoulders, knowing that there is an organization they can tell their stories to. It's nice to feel heard, especially when you've spent all your life feeling as though nobody would believe you. I must say, I was relieved to find out that you accept stories via email as well. I'll try to keep the word limit to as much as I can, but I've always been a little verbose when it comes to writing. I'm much better at it than talking out loud. Even after all these years, I'm just not confident that I'll be able to speak coherently about this situation. I have a terrible stutter, you see, and it gets much worse when I'm nervous. There I go again, rambling. With that introduction out of the way, I'll tell you about the unusual encounter that I had 12 years ago. I'm 24 years old now, so I was 12 at the time. Still a kid, but of course I thought I was very grown up. That's why I didn't question the safety of walking into the woods alone. You have to understand, I lived very close by. It wasn't out of the way, and everyone I knew went into those woods from time to time. It was a regular thing. I never went there in the dark, of course. All of this happened in broad daylight, would you believe it? They never show that in scary movies. When it's fiction, everything scary happens after dark, and you're safe as long as the sun is shining. Well, I wasn't safe, and to be frank, I haven't felt entirely safe since. I moved out of my small town as soon as I turned 17. I was a year ahead of everyone else in school, so I got an early entrance into college, and I picked one that was several states away. I tell people that it was because they offered the best English program, which was what I was interested in, and it's partially true. They did have a good English program, but that wasn't exactly why I chose it. I just wanted to be far, far away. I'd heard a few stories before about local people seeing something unsettling deep in the woods. They were always vague about it, some sort of large predator that stalked them for a while and scared the life out of them. I never thought much of it, to be honest, and I don't think anyone else did either. It's mountain lion territory around here, and they're known for stalking their prey, sometimes for miles on end. Mountain lions are shy, though, and they're pretty easily scared by loud noise. I had seen a few of them by that point, even a mother with cubs once, but that was always when I was deep in the woods with my parents by my side. Mountain lions didn't come anywhere near town. The noise of the traffic and people on the streets was too much for them. So yes, I was scared of mountain lions, but I never ventured far enough into the woods on my own for that to be a problem. Looking back, I wonder about the rumours that I heard floating around town, and immediately dismissed as nothing more than a paranoid person encountering a mountain lion when they weren't expecting to. I'm sure some of them did see mountain lions, and maybe even a bear, although those are much less common around here. But some of them, I wonder if they had seen something different, something much more terrifying. I wonder if they saw the same thing I did that day in the woods. It was about 3 p.m., a spring afternoon, and I was meandering through the woods. I didn't have any real agenda other than poking things with sticks and maybe climbing a few trees. I was bored, you see. It was a small town. Not much to do, not much to see. I found a few things of interest, all of which were poked by the stick I carried with me. A dead rabbit, buzzing with flies, a large crop of mushrooms, a pile of dung. I started circling back around, making my way out of the deeper parts of the forest towards the lighter thickets near town. My feet were starting to hurt, growing pains, and I was ready to go home and have a snack. It was all very mundane. It was then that I felt all the hairs on the back of my neck and arms stand on end. It wasn't cold. In fact, I was sweating under my t-shirt. But something had set my body on edge, and my body had responded without my mind being able to process exactly what I was sensing. I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I could almost feel 2 eyes burning a hole into the back of my neck with the force of their stare. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Just the dark trees I had walked through moments ago. I kept walking, but fast now, my breathing heavy. There was another dead rabbit, this one dead much longer, but I didn't have the urge to investigate it. Instead, I had to fight the urge not to break into a jog. It was this weird instinctive feeling, almost like something had been passed down from my primitive ancestors. I didn't think that at the time, of course, but now that I'm an adult, I've had plenty of time to reflect on why I reacted the way I did. That same instinct told me that if I ran, whatever was watching me would know that I knew it was watching me, and it would give chase. I walked as fast as I dared, clutching the stick in my fist as if it would somehow protect me. I counted my steps and breaths. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. The air that I sucked into my lungs had an incredibly strong smell, a mix of decay and fresh meat. It was putrid. I swallowed the bile down that rose up in the back of my throat and kept my breathing as shallow as I could, trying not to think too hard about exactly what I was smelling. Suddenly, I was out of the shadow of the last of the trees, standing in pure afternoon sunlight. There were cars on the road and people on the street. It was like I had been transported back to reality. It was only after about 10 paces into the sun that I dared to finally turn around for the second time. The thing that was following me had stopped just short of the tree line. To someone on the street, it would look like a passing shadow, but my eyes had adjusted to the dark of the forest, so I could see its outline in a fair amount of detail. I know that in your advertisement you ask for participants in the study to give as much detail as possible, so I'll do my best, although bear in mind that this is a very unusual thing to describe. It was very, very thin. That's the first thing I noticed. It was so thin that its bones seemed to push against the skin, as if they were trying to escape. The head was shaped like the skull underneath, with sunken eye sockets and eyes that glowed inside of them. I don't mean that the eyes reflected the sunlight. I mean that they seemed to produce their own light, like hot coals. It was standing on 2 legs, 2 hind legs, but the front legs were so long that the bony knuckles almost dragged along the ground. I can't be sure how, but at the time, I remember thinking that the creature had far too many joints. An extra elbow here, an extra wrist there, and the fingers seemed to bend and distort impossibly. I froze in place. I felt strangely safe in the sun, that same primitive instinct telling me that whatever this was, and no matter how much it wanted to hurt me, it wouldn't do so on a brightly lit street full of witnesses. Still, I would have felt a lot safer if I was further away, but I couldn't make my feet take those extra steps. The hot coal eyes stared directly at me, pinning me to the spot. I felt like a dead bug on a corkboard. We stared at each other, me with fear in my eyes, the creature with absolutely unbridled hunger and rage in his. Then it moved. Slowly, disjointedly, it lifted its right arm into the air. The horrible hand dangled at the wrist, but it moved that wrist side to side in the unmistakable human gesture of a wave. Why did I wave back? I'm still not sure. What a dumb thing to do. I did, though. I lifted my shaking hand into the air and mirrored the gesture. I hoped that this meant that we were farewelling each other for good, and that we would not meet again. With that, the creature slowly began to back away the way it had come. It didn't take its eyes off of me the entire time, not even to glance down at the ground. It was clumsy, brushing into the tree branches and stumbling. But the head kept looking forward, and those terrible eyes were locked with mine. I watched, still frozen, as the lights of his eyes became dimmer and dimmer. I kept watching long after I could no longer distinguish the creature from the shadows around it. Kept watching even after I was certain it was long gone. I was sick for days after I got home. Mum was gently chiding, certain that I'd caught a cold wandering around in the woods without a jacket. I couldn't bring myself to tell her anything about the creature or what had shaken me so badly, so I let her believe that I was nothing more than very ill. My stomach churned constantly during those days, unable to escape the awful smell of rotting that made bile rise up in the back of my throat. The hairs on the back of my neck took days to stop standing on end, and it took even longer to shake the feeling of those eyes burning into mine. When I drifted off into sleep, it was fitful, and as soon as I realized I was dreaming, I would be full of fear. I was paranoid that the creature could follow me into my dream somehow, that it could see what I was thinking. I doubt that it could, but I was only a child, and I was terrified. I dreamed of my eyes watching me, stalking me, waiting for the day when I could let my guard down and become easy prey. I imagined that the creature was furious with me for escaping from it and leading it closer to town, and I could only hope it wasn't intelligent enough to seek out revenge. For all I know, it never followed me or even thought of me again. If I had to guess, I would say that the only reason I didn't have a second encounter was that I refused to enter those woods again under any circumstances. I faked a crippling allergy to poison ivy, where even breathing in the smell of the plant would make me wheeze and break out in coughing fits. My parents put it down to the effect that my prolonged illness had on my immune system, and although they still invited me on occasional trips into the woods, they didn't press the issue much. Every time somebody I knew went into those woods, I would sit by the phone obsessively until I heard from them. Nobody knew I ever went missing. But funnily enough, the population of mountain lions in the area dwindled down and down until it reached zero. People assumed it was the growing size of the town that drove the mountain lions away, but I don't believe them. I know exactly what happened to those mountain lions. They were stalked in the same way that they stalked their own prey, and then they were eaten. There isn't a doubt in my mind about that. I still don't like the wilderness. I'm decidedly more of a big city guy or a nice beach if I happen to have a week of vacation. As soon as I have a clear view of everything happening around me, with no trees to hide in, I'm calm and relaxed. Even a park with a large thicket of trees is too much for me. Although I know rationally that the creature isn't hiding out in a park in a city full of people, I can't escape that feeling that something might be in the trees, watching me. Call it paranoia. Call it PTSD. I call it instincts, and instincts are the thing that saved me that day. Anyway, I'm sure I'm far over the word limit now, so I'll leave it there. Thank you again for the opportunity to tell somebody about this experience. And when the study is published, I look forward to seeing if anyone else out there has seen the same creature. Story 11. My story started as a fairy tale that turned very sour very quickly. I had been married for only 4 years, and half of it had been far from pleasant. The fights were countless, and they got worse and worse each day. Some days I seriously feared my husband and I would end up hurting each other. Eventually, neither of us could continue to ignore the ending was near, but as couples often do, we made one last desperate attempt to rekindle our relationship. We rented a cabin in the woods a couple of hours away from our city. There was a lake nearby. The weather was nearly perfect, and the place itself had been extremely comfortable. Halfway through the weekend, we had an explosive fight and decided to start the paperwork for a divorce on Monday morning. That is, if we managed to survive the weekend first. It was Saturday evening, and I couldn't for the life of me picture spending another minute locked in that cabin with that man. The cabin was so charming that it felt like it was mocking us. We had to get away, and tragically, we only had one car. The silence inside that car was enough to drive a person mad, but we were both aware that as soon as we said something, we would only end up arguing again. We were both furious with each other, disgusted, and to be fair, a little heartbroken. Now, I don't know if this was for better or worse, but pretty soon, we had a few distractions from our doomed marriage. It was getting dark and fast. As he drove, my husband started mumbling under his breath, complaining about the terrible roads, the tall trees that obscured the view, and the quality of his own car. I tried to ignore him, to avoid starting another fight, but I was starting to feel uneasy too. It seriously got dark too fast, and we had never been around here before. If we got lost, it would be too much for me, and I knew as well as he did that the car was past due a visit to the mechanic. There were many things spiking my anxiety at that moment, not to mention the damn cold. During the day, the weather had been perfect, and it was reasonable that it would get colder as the sun went down, but it was still ridiculous just how fast the temperature dropped from one second to another. We had to roll up the windows and bam! The crash. The stupid poor deer that ran on the road at the worst possible second. The scream that came out of me upon the impact was so loud and shrill that it left my throat burning. My husband's head snapped against the window hard enough to leave a bruise. But I couldn't focus on his well-being or mine. All my attention was on the windshield of the car. The bloody windshield of the car. Jesus, it looked like the deer had exploded upon coming into contact with the vehicle. It wasn't just blood. There were leaves and hair and, oh my God, the moment I realized the deer's guts were splattered on the hood of our car, I had to throw open the passenger's door and throw up right there in the middle of the road. Naturally, we had to stop the car to assess the damage and find a way to go on. But I was struck by my husband's words as soon as he got out of the car. He said, "Damn, does your puke really smell that bad?" He was being cruel. We were still upset with each other, but I could smell that too. "It's not me," I said defensively, but also suspicious. I could smell that too, and it was so awful. There was no way that smell could come out of my ruined dinner. In fact, I doubted such a rotten smell could come out of anything remotely human. I guess it had to be the deer. "Don't look," my husband said, and dragged the body of the deer away from the car to clear the road. But you know how it goes. Curiosity killed the cat. "My God, what happened to it?" I exclaimed, looking at the deer, or what was left of it. It wasn't a regular deer, even before our car hit it. My husband attempted a joke, but I could see he was unsettled as I was. The reason there was so much blood splattered on our car now was because the impact cut off the head of the poor animal. Why? Because it had been barely attached to the body to begin with. I thought I was going to throw up again. I could barely believe my eyes. There were bite marks all over the deer's body. Something had been eating that thing alive. It was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. I nearly had to throw up again. My husband had a few theories. Wolves, bears, I think he even thought about birds. But nothing felt right. I just couldn't stop looking at it. My husband used a bottle of water we had in the car to clean the windshield at least a little. But that wasn't our biggest problem. One of the tires of the car was ruined. The two of us cursed our luck when we noticed it. This couldn't be worse. I helped him as much as I could, but we were a couple on the verge of a divorce, and it was clear we did not work well together. He mentioned that I would be more helpful just giving him space while he worked on changing the tire, and I didn't need to be told twice. I turned on my phone's flashlight and decided to explore a little. I'm aware that exploring the woods in a zone I wasn't familiar with at night wasn't exactly a good idea, but what else could I do? I needed space from my husband. I couldn't stand the sight of the dead deer and the bloody windshield. I needed fresh air. The latter, however, proved to be quite difficult. It seemed that no matter where I turned, the awful smell only got worse. I covered my nose with my hand, but it was almost useless. Plus, I was starting to shiver. No one had warned me that these damn woods would be so cold at night. I was from the city. I wasn't used to any of this. Every time a small animal or insect ran past me, I jumped and shrieked a little. It was embarrassing. I did not stop to think that all of them were running away in the exact direction I was walking towards. I got distracted. I noticed the trail of blood on the ground. It had to be from the deer. That poor thing had been so severely wounded even before crossing our path. I know I wasn't thinking very clearly. My life was in shambles. My relationship was on fire. The crash with the deer had me traumatized and feeling sick. The air was so cold my brain felt frozen. And no matter what I did, the nausea refused to leave my body. So I started mindlessly following that trail of blood. It was mesmerizing in some messed up way. The red droplets of blood glowed under the light of the moon. Until they didn't. Until there was barely any light at all. The woods were suddenly much thicker, and the tops of the trees were like a roof above my head. The lack of light was unfortunate because I could swear that I was seeing something else along with the trail of blood. Those were footprints. Part of me didn't even want to check to make sure, but I couldn't help it. I turned on the flashlight of my phone toward the ground and I gasped loudly at what I saw. Those weren't just footprints, they were human footprints. It was a pair of naked human feet. The moment of realization was like a cold shower. We weren't alone in the forest. I felt frozen in place. My brain like a bullet train on fire through all the possible worst scenarios. And then I heard it. Something stepped on a fallen branch. The crack made me jump. Then I heard it again. Something was walking toward me. I sprang into action and started running as fast as I possibly could back towards the car. I didn't look back. I didn't hesitate. I paid no mind to the puddles of blood I had to step on. I just kept running even through the branches that scratched my face arms, and clothes. When I reached the car, I jumped inside and locked all the doors behind me. My husband was confused and, frankly, a little scared, but he was done with the tire and smart enough to follow my lead. "Drive. Just drive. Please just get me out of here," I begged him. We were in a terrible place in our relationship, but he knew I was serious. When he started the car, I was able to take a big, comforting breath, but it was short-lived. A second later, I noticed my husband look through the rearview mirror and flinch. He tried to stifle his gasp of surprise, but it was too late. I had noticed. I relentlessly and desperately asked him if he had seen another person, until he finally snapped and reassured me. "No, I didn't see another person. Calm down." He drove away fast and we made it home in one piece, ready to worry about anything other than that strange encounter in the woods. It isn't until now that I find myself overthinking his words. He didn't see another person coming out of the woods into the road behind our car. But could it be possible that he saw something else? Something he couldn't put into words? Something he would rather not share with me? Story 12. I wish I could say that none of what happened was my fault, but I have to admit that I took many terrible, terrible decisions that led to the events I'm about to describe. However, even if I can explain and account for missteps and bad choices, there's an overwhelming amount of details in my story that frankly don't make any sense to me. There has to be something out there responsible for the things I saw, things that can't be blamed on me, things I doubt any animal could have made, things I am certain can't be human-made. Everything started in what was supposed to be a regular Saturday. Usually, I spent my Saturday mornings riding bikes in the mountains near the city with a small group of friends and acquaintances. This Saturday, something changed, and it was the first bad sign. Apparently, a considerable number of people had chosen to join us. To make the most of the occasion, some people decided to charge a small sum of money to buy fruits, snacks, water, and an improved first aid kit on our regular Saturday outing. I was outraged. I couldn't believe it. Charge money just to join them on a stupid bike ride. It wasn't even that much money, but it was mine, and I wouldn't be paying so some strangers could have a Band-Aid. Long story short, there was a big argument, and I refused to join them. When Saturday morning finally rolled around and I was still in a sour mood, I told myself I didn't need anyone else to go out and ride my bike. Of course, I wouldn't want to run into them though, as it would have been extremely awkward. But the solution seemed simple enough. I would just go somewhere else. After all, the mountains were big. There were plenty of trails, and I was perhaps a little overconfident in my skills and experience to try out completely new areas on my own. Very quickly, I realized things wouldn't be as easy as I made them out to be in my life. Of course, it never crossed my mind the possibility of a very sinister turn of events. But the predictable and ordinary obstacles of everyday life don't take too long before making an appearance. I spent most of the morning on my phone, reading about the different trails around the zone. But it's very frustrating research. Half of the trails are for beginners, and the least popular trails are talked about in what I thought were honestly ridiculous ways, talking about ghosts and all kinds of supernatural nonsense. I was feeling forced out of my usual group. I wouldn't be intimidated away from the mountains. The day was full of bad omens, though. The moment I went to get my bike ready, I was sadly reminded that there was a little something wrong with it since last weekend, and I had to put off fixing it for too long. I had to get to work on that. It was well after lunch when I finally left my house, turning a blind eye to the grey clouds in the distance and going as fast as possible. It was just my luck to get the distractions mixed up and get a little lost before reaching the right path I had selected. To this day, I still wonder, did I actually find the path I was supposed to? Did I venture into a forgotten and damned path from the start? When I finally jumped on my bike and started moving on the path up the mountain, I felt like I could finally let down my guard. First, I moved quite fast, letting out all my frustrations into the movement of my legs, relishing on the burning feeling in my muscles and my lungs. I was delighted by the afternoon sun falling on me and the new and exotic sights of this side of the mountains. I didn't rest until it was extremely necessary, and I ended up going further than planned. I didn't stop to turn around until I was high enough on the hill to think, damn, it's going to be a long journey back down. That was the understatement of the year. I had no idea what kind of frights were waiting down there for me. From up the mountain, I was able to see more clearly that the grey clouds in the sky had dramatically multiplied, and they were pretty much on top of me. Even though I was considerably tired, I knew the smart thing was to leave now and move fast. That was the first time I thought it hadn't been such a good idea to go out alone on a path totally unknown to me. The dark clouds meant that the day was growing dark much faster than usual, and I got chills down my body thinking about getting lost in a strange zone at night. But that wasn't even the worst part. I was going down fast, with a cold freeze hitting my body, and the first little drops of rain hitting me like tiny bullets. A terrible sign. And then I heard it, a huge booming thunder. It startled me so bad. It felt so loud, so sudden, it felt dangerously close. And the whole mountain illuminated for one terrible instant. The light and awful sound were more than enough to make me flinch, make me lose control, and turn my bike in the wrong direction. There was a horrifying moment of stillness and weightlessness when I considered I could genuinely die like this, out here in the rain, on an unexplored path, completely alone. But for the first time that day, I was lucky. The fall was rough and I would be tending to my scratches for all of next week, but nothing was broken, I was sure of it. I thought the only problem was that one of my ankles was twisted, and apparently the repairs I did on my bike earlier that day weren't as good as I had thought. I would have to go back to the main road walking. But the simple fact that I was still alive made me sigh with relief. But that feeling was short-lived. The next second, my senses were attacked by the worst scent I've ever smelt in my life. What the hell was that? It smelled as if I had fallen right on top of a dead animal's carcass. I looked around me quickly, but I couldn't see anything like it nearby. I kept myself from gagging at the smell and pulled myself up from the ground. Neither my right foot nor my bike was in great shape, but I had to drag myself away from there quickly. My bike rattled at my side as I moved downhill, but it wasn't enough to distract me from all the other sounds around me. The thunder was getting louder, closer. The rain hit the trees and the leaves and the murmur wasn't exactly soothing. And then, the footsteps. It was a horrible feeling. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining them, but they were undeniable. First, something distant stepped on the broken branches behind me, then something a few steps to my right. Or was it my left? No. There was something definitely walking at a quick pace on my right side. Perhaps there was something slithering slowly over dry leaves on my left side too. No, there was something or someone running directly toward me from down the hill. The effect of these sounds all around me was almost enough to drive me mad. And that's without even mentioning the things I saw. It started simply enough. A group of bushes broke and crashed as if a very large animal had laid on top of them. I gulped nervously, thinking of all the horrible things that could happen to me if there was a bear nearby. I pushed my body to move faster, but this plan backfired and I ended up falling flat on my face. I groaned loudly and lay there in the mud for a second, cursing my luck and the entire universe, wondering if saving a little bit of money had really been worth it. That's when I opened my eyes and looked at the ground in front of me. Footprints, and not just any kind. Those were impressively large hooves, I racked my brain thinking of possible options. Cows, horses, goats. But something in the back of my mind told me it didn't fit. Besides, I didn't have enough time to overanalyze the situation, because along with the footprints I got sight of a few drops of blood. My entire body was trembling, and it wasn't just the cold. My hand was shaking when I reached out. I really didn't want to do this, but when my fingertip touched the red spot on the ground, the answer was undeniable. That was fresh blood. Fresh blood spilled all over me. While I was limping all alone in an unfamiliar part of the woods, was this going to be the end of me? I was beyond desperate. My ankle throbbed, and I was leaving pieces of my bike behind, but I had to run. I started screaming, "Help! Help! Is someone there? Please help me! Can anybody hear me?" While the entire time I moved as fast as I could, with the rain hitting me mercilessly, my heart beating out of my chest, and my eyes playing tricks on me. I saw terrible marks on the trees. Were those scratches the result of a psycho's knife? The claws of a beast? Something entirely different and most likely worse? I saw red puddles on the ground, and I stepped on them without knowing if it was mud or blood. I saw a pair of antlers ahead of me, and then to my right, and on to my left, a little too high above the ground, a little too big to be from any animal I was familiar with, and yet whose body I never saw. I kept screaming, "Help! Please, anybody help me!" the entire time, until I reached the side of the road. I was well aware of the sound of footsteps somewhere behind me, but I refused to look back, even when a merciful driver pulled over to give me a ride. I didn't look back once. I couldn't bear it. Story 13. There are a lot of ways I could possibly tell this story. I mean, where to begin? For example, reasons why I was forced to leave the US after losing most of my life savings and most of my lifelong friendships, abandoning a college I couldn't pay for, and dreams I was starting to hate. Perhaps I could go as far as my teenage years, that awkward period where friend groups came and went, but the only constant in my life was a puppy named Waltz that had been the center of my universe since then. But I guess the point of the story is this bizarre, disgusting, utterly terrifying experience I lived in the price location of middle of nowhere, Canada. My journey to this country was a mess. Pure chaos from beginning to end. A cancelled flight, missing luggage that had half of my money, getting in an argument with the man sitting beside me on the plane. Then, on land, getting a shitty meal, being dropped off wildly off course after turning down the advances of a creepy, thirsty, depraved taxi driver, and spending what little money I had left renting a car. Oh, did I mention I immediately got lost? I couldn't afford to move to a big city, so I had to rent a small apartment in a smaller town, but I severely miscalculated the distances and the depths of the woods that separated the airport and the little town where I was meant to arrive. So it was just me, my little dog, a couple of bags, and a string of prayers I mumbled every now and then that I wouldn't run out of gas before arriving at civilization. It seemed the car wouldn't fail me, but that didn't mean something else wouldn't go wrong. It started to get dark. Really dark. The night was falling all around me, and I was seeing fewer and fewer cars driving past. But I was trying my hardest to keep calm and not let my mind wander to the worst possible scenarios. It was difficult though. I was a simple young woman alone in a new country for the first time, completely lost, driving a rented car through unfamiliar roads, guided by nothing but a map downloaded to a phone with no signal and less than 10% of the battery left. I couldn't help but think of the man that looked like he wanted to kill me on the plane, the taxi driver that looked like he wanted to eat me alive. Every friend that ever stabbed me in the back when I achieved any success they had been hungry for. Greedy like animals that very well could be lurking in this dark and seemingly unending woods at this very instant. My only company was my poor little dog. Waltz isn't even a very intimidating kind of dog. He is a mutt I adopted almost 10 years ago. He is one of the smartest dogs I've ever met, but, like every genius, he couldn't get through life without completely random and sometimes unexplainable moments of utter foolishness. This was proved to me when Waltz's instincts turned out to be the reason I almost died this night. I think. Everything started because I was overthinking how quickly the car was burning through the gas. At that moment, nothing seemed more frightening than the idea of having my car break down in the middle of nowhere in the night. So I turned off the air conditioning and rolled down the windows. However, this move turned against me very quickly. I was moving slowly down a curve in the road when I was hit by a terrible gust of cold air. It was so intense it made me shiver and nearly lose control of the wheel. When I regained a little of my strength, I rolled the windows back up. That's when something went terribly wrong. The cold must have hit Waltz too, because the little dog started howling desperately as if wounded. It made me jump. It put my nerves on end, and when I reached out to pet him with one hand, he flinched violently away from me. When the windows started going up, Waltz did the unimaginable and jumped out of the window. I let out a high-pitched scream of his name and slammed the brakes of the car. This was so odd. Waltz was completely used to traveling in cars since he was a puppy. Since it was so quiet out here, I didn't think twice about leaving the car parked in the middle of the road. I was just scared out of my mind of the idea of losing my only friend in the world. I only grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and jumped out of the car. I started calling Waltz's name, and I ran in the direction he went in. Of course, the little thing had to go into the woods in the middle of the night. I cursed my bad luck. This looked like something out of my worst nightmares. It didn't help that as soon as I stepped off the road and into the damp soil of the forest, I was invaded by a terrible smell. I flinched back for a second, but kept walking. However, the more I walked, the worse was the smell. It was so nasty, so rotten, it made my stomach ache immediately. I started to fear I'd end up vomiting before even finding Waltz. My mind was busy conjuring up the worst images. My little dog, finding the carcass of a dead animal in the woods, eating its rotten flesh and blood and blackened organs. The flies buzzing around, the lifeless eyes of the animal staring at me. "Waltz!" I yelled desperately, at the top of my lungs, and with tears in my eyes. I was shaking. I don't know if it was fear, the awful smell, the bone-chilling cold, or something else. But finally, I earned a bit of luck. My shrill cry worked, and I heard barking in the distance, coming closer and closer, accompanied by the rustling of leaves, the crunching of dead leaves on the ground. I think, at that moment, I didn't think too hard about how heavy the steps sounded, how loudly the leaves and bushes were sounding for the movement of such a tiny dog. I only cared about getting my buddy back. But Waltz was terrified. The dog ran towards me at full speed and jumped in my arms. I held him tightly, and I was about to start whispering soothing sounds, but I got distracted. My eyes wandered back to the direction where Waltz had been running from. All at once, I felt my heart skip a beat. I gasped. My dog whimpered. My body trembled. All I remember were antlers, long and sharp and standing at an incredible height off the ground. Don't ask me about eyes. I don't even want to try and remember if I saw them or not. All I know is that I started running, screaming and running, and I didn't stop screaming not until I was in the car. With Waltz in my lap, driving faster than ever before, feeling warmth creep back into my bones and the rotten smell finally leave my senses. Story 14. My research started out quite well. I rented a cabin by the lake to stay there for a week. The first day I worked on the water, the next day right on the shore. The job was pretty easy. I spent the morning collecting samples of the soil, organic matter, and minerals of a delimited area. Then, during the afternoon and night, I locked myself up in my cabin to study the results and write up my paper. The thing is, I'm only doing this because of the money. It's almost a silly job, and I'm certain dozens of other scientists, before and worse than me, have been here before. But one of those got assigned to perform this task and decided they had enough money to spare to pay a poor soul to do the job for them. I am that poor soul. Proudly. Every morning, I woke up at dawn in that cold and lonely cabin, and I only dragged myself out of bed because I could almost taste the final payment. There was only one little problem. I miscalculated the risks of this job. The problem started on Thursday. By then, I had worked up my way quite far from the lake. The results of the research were still boring, but the sights deep in the forest were at least a little more interesting. They would turn out to be a little too interesting. Since I had to walk longer distances, I got back to the cabin a little later. On Thursday, the sun was starting to go down, and I could already see the cabin a short distance away from me. That's when I heard it for the first time. Something stepped on a fallen branch, and the sudden crack in the middle of the deep silence of the forest completely startled me and made me stop in my tracks. I looked around and immediately wished I didn't. Somewhere behind, hopefully very far away, I saw something move. But it wasn't a small bit of movement. No, it was damn fast. Something literally flew by. I doubted some kind of big bird of prey could fly in the midst of this thick forest, let alone make such a noise. It was like a gust of wind rattling a dozen bushes and trees in the span of a second. I had no idea if bears could be that fast, but I had no intention of making myself an easy prey and waiting to find out. Without doubting myself and without looking back, I ran all the way back to the cabin, locked all the doors, and put all my focus on my work. By the time I went to bed, I forgot all about that small incident. The next day wasn't any better. The results of the tests are finally showing something interesting, but I regret wishing for this. In a small sample of the soil in the forest, I found a quite confusing mixture of freshly dropped blood along with badly rotting flesh. The awful smell was what caught my attention in the first place, but I didn't expect to be startled by the results. I get a chill down my body when I realize I'm working with more than boring minerals. But above all things, I'm a man of science. I'm doing a scientific job. I won't let a few gross fluids and bad smells scare me away. In fact, that day I went out with a little more drive than the previous days. I walked on the damp soil firmly and quickly, and even took larger samples to take back to my makeshift lab inside the cabin. I expected my newfound passion to make me finish earlier, but it turns out that taking a genuine interest in your job ends up making you work for longer. I told myself that I was a professional. I knew what I was doing and I had nothing to fear. Yet no matter how much I repeated those things to myself, when the time to face real dangers arrived, I found myself thoroughly unprepared. It was Friday, the sun was starting to go down, and I was hurrying to finish taking samples from this area of the forest. Regardless of the bad feeling in the back of my head, I wanted to be back at the cabin before it was too dark. But in my haste, I ended up dropping my bag, making the contents spill out messily around me. I sighed, cursed my luck, and dropped down to my knees to shove everything back into the bag. Then, I was aggressively interrupted. I heard a shuffling sound and footsteps running in my direction, but not soon enough to react and avoid impact. I was still crouched down when a wild rabbit jumped out of some bushes and ran against my side. This took me off balance and I fell down to the moist ground, looking around me, scared out of my mind. That's when I realized what it had been. A rabbit, but not a normal one. No. This animal was badly hurt. It was almost entirely covered in blood. It was so messy that I couldn't even see exactly what was wrong, but I thought there was a huge wound on its side. Did someone shoot this little thing? Did I fail to hear a shot nearby? Worse, was there a person around here shooting anything that moved? A simple thought scared me so badly that I shoved what I could in my bag and decided to leave everything else behind. "I'm sorry, I can't help you," I helplessly whispered to the morbid rabbit, as if it could hear me and forgive me. Then I ran all the way back to the cabin. When I got inside my little house by the lake, I gagged upon realizing that my shirt was stained with rabbit's blood. But it wasn't half as bad as when I emptied the contents of my bag just to discover I had carelessly picked up and carried a completely random bone from the middle of the forest. Oh my God, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was attacked by a strong wave of nausea. I felt that my body and all my things were contaminated by this. I paced around the room, shaking until I had mildly controlled my breathing. But things only got worse when I gathered the courage to study that bone a little closer. I knew it looked strange at first sight. I'm not a stranger to bones. I have grown tired of studying them. But this was fresh, let's say. It wasn't a bone from a long-dead skeleton. No. This was an animal's bone, recently extricated from the rest of the body, and, Jesus Christ, there was still some meat attached to one end of it. At that point, I was disgusted, upset, but just about ready to dispose of that bone and go to bed to try to forget everything. However, the night was young. I was still standing there with my blood-stained clothes and the gross little bone on my table, when a really, really cold breeze made me shiver. I turned around to go and close the window, but all I got to do was let out a loud shriek of terror. I stumbled backward and nearly fell over my table, sending a bunch of things chattering noisily down to the ground. But when I focused on the window again, those eyes were gone. Those red, glowing, piercing eyes were gone. I shook my head and rubbed my eyes. My encounter with the stupid dying rabbit must have shocked me to my core. This was a clear symptom of a disturbed mind. I wouldn't allow myself to think of unreasonable and illogical explanations. Still, I ran toward the window to close it down firmly. I thought that would be the end of it, but I was at a loss about the terrible cold that still surrounded my body. I shivered again, but all the windows were closed. I needed a sweater, quick. But I would be distracted again. I felt like I was going out of my mind, unsettled by all my senses. Not just the cold, not just the brief hallucination. I started to smell a putrid scent taking over my room. I groaned loudly, annoyed by the whole thing, and without even flinching, I grabbed the disgusting bone I'd picked up and prepared to throw it out the window. I opened the window quickly, and then the strangest thing happened. I looked down at the bone and I wondered for a second, who did this? What kind of beast devoured this poor animal? What kind of prey had it been? How did it taste? Did it satisfy a deep and unexplainable urge? Surely this bone I was holding in my hand couldn't possibly come from another human. My grotesque train of thoughts was violently stopped by a noise coming from outside of my cabin. Something was rustling in the trees around the cabin. Something fast, big, and straight out of my nightmares. Before I could throw up, scream, cry, or even consider going out to investigate, I threw the bone outside and quickly locked the window. It was the beginning of the worst night of my life. I didn't sleep for a second, tortured by the cold, the disgusting scents, the sounds coming from the outside, the feeling of a glowing pair of eyes watching me from every corner. I abandoned the cabin and the lake and my research early the next day, and I'll never forget running away. Story 15. I never believed in the supernatural. I mean, it's the 21st century, so it would be absurd if I did, right? Growing up, my family always went to my grandpa's house for Christmas every year. It is a family tradition that we still observe to date, even though Grandpa is no more. Grandpa's house was located in the outskirts of town, close to the woods. I remember always sitting with the other kids, mostly cousins, around the campfire roasting marshmallows as Grandpa tried to scare us with some horrific stories. Even though we had heard Grandpa's stories many times, we still got scared each time, because Grandpa had a way of making his stories seem so realistic that you'd think he was speaking from experience. Or was he? Each Christmas, there was always a new case of people, especially children, disappearing in the woods. There were different theories as regards to the whereabouts of the missing people. While the police think it could be a case of a serial killer, the majority of the townspeople believe that it could be an animal attack. On this particular Christmas, my family and I went over to Grandpa's house like we always do every Christmas. I was 17 at the time, but somehow I was still as excited about going to Grandpa's house as I used to be back when I was younger. Perhaps even more excited, because I saw it as an opportunity to write something interesting for extra credit in school. To be honest, I had been secretly obsessing about solving the mystery of why people keep disappearing in the woods. And even though I didn't know how to go about it, I had already made up my mind to get to the bottom of the matter no matter what it takes. I kept this little quest of mine a secret. This year's Christmas was special. One of my uncles was going to get married. Grandpa's house was full as different relatives came, mainly to attend my uncle's wedding. The last time the house was this full was during Grandpa's burial. Thinking about it made me a little emotional. The house was buzzing with activities. The adults were too busy making preparations for the wedding that they paid less attention to the kids. I snuck out of the house a couple of times. But funnily enough, no one in my family noticed my absence. I know I should be happy about it, but instead I felt this sense of insignificance. And to be honest, I was a little disappointed in my family. That morning, I had gone to ask the sheriff if maybe I could take a look at the file of cases regarding the disappearances that happened in the woods. At first, he was skeptical about it, but eventually he had to give in when I told him I was researching for a school project. With his guidance, I went through each case file, and all cases had something in common. A trail of blood and pieces of torn flesh that are scattered in such a way you'd think it was an animal attack. The only way of identifying each victim was through the properties they leave behind, or the DNA material recovered by forensics. I could see the expression of disappointment on the face of the sheriff as he was explaining all these things to me, and that got me even more motivated to get to the bottom of it all. Talking to the sheriff gave me some insight into those cases. Later that day, as I was thinking about what I had seen, I heard my mum calling from outside of my room. "Michael, is your cousin there? Tell him his mum is calling." That made me realize that my cousin Tommy, whom I shared the room with, was not in the room. I just told my mum he is not in the room, even though I was a little surprised because Tommy was always so busy playing video games on his phone that he barely steps out of the room. After a while, I started hearing voices from outside of my room, and when I came out to find out what the problem was, I heard that Tommy was missing. I felt a cold sweat run through my back immediately I heard those words. Tommy never left the room, and that was what made it even scarier. Where could he have gone? That was the question on everyone's mind. It was getting dark, and we knew we had to search for him before it was too late. The whole family was divided into two groups. The most elderly and the women were left at home to watch over the younger kids, while the men went out in search of Tommy. My parents never wanted me to join them in the search, but when they could not convince me to stay back, they let me tag along. I suggested we start from the woods before it got too dark. Every one of us held a flashlight, while my dad and Tommy's dad both held shotguns for protection. We all went into the woods together, refusing to split for fear of losing anyone else. As we ventured into the woods, we kept shouting Tommy's name, hoping he'd hear us. By this time, I was already so scared. I kept getting flashes of the bloody scenes I had seen before. I kept praying that we would find Tommy soon and all go home. As we ventured deeper into the woods, we saw something glowing from afar. As we came closer, we started hearing some unfamiliar noise. It was nothing like I'd heard before. A sense of terror overwhelmed me. Not just me, but everyone with me. Even the animals in the woods were startled in a way that showed the presence of a predator. As we went further, we saw what still terrorizes me to this day. There it was, a giant man-like demon with sunken but glowing eyes that looked like hot coal. It had these sharp teeth that looked like fangs and claws like that of a wild beast. The sight of this creature sent shivers down my spine. My dad and uncle shot at it a couple of times until it disappeared at a very unnatural speed. At that point, we all made our way back as quickly as we could, all looking terrified at what we had seen. When we got home, we were still too shocked to notice that Tommy was already back. He had only just stepped outside to have a wander. The scenes from that day kept flashing in my mind for quite some time. I was already sure that all those missing people must have met their ultimate death at the hands of this evil creature of the woods. Story 16. The following are excerpts from a collection of journals belonging to Edgar Holloway, which were found among the collapsed remains of an abandoned cabin near half-frozen falls in Maine's North Woods. November 11th. Today was my lucky day. I found 7 different species and caught clear photos of all of them. It took half an hour to get close enough to the snowy owl on my own, but I pulled it off. November 12th. Buck kept barking outside Sadie's crafting room again this morning. How do you tell a dog that the lady who used to feed him every day is never coming back? She's not inside there knitting you a sweater. She's dead, Buck. Sadie's dead. November 15th. I got tired of the barking and finally got around to cleaning out that stupid crafting room. I wonder if anyone in town would want to buy all this yarn. After that, I went for a brisk autumn walk and saw half a dozen ducks paddling downstream. November 16th. Last night, Buck kept me up half the night barking at nothing through the screen door, as if he saw something I didn't. Not even a bone calmed down that dog. He wasn't ever my dog, so I don't know what's wrong with him. November 17th. Note to self. Remember gloves tomorrow. Winter is coming quicker than I thought. Not the white ones, only the red ones. November 18th. I went out to Lookout Point this morning. Sadie used to recommend coming out here in the mornings when the light sparkles on the surface of the lake. She thought it would attract more birds. I only spotted a few Canadian geese out there today, though. I sat there for hours, on the big flat boulder she'd perched on. When I got up, I fell and bloodied up my knee. It felt like I'd been shoved. I looked around for a culprit, but nobody was around. November 21st. I tried the lookout again. I think I saw a few shadow tails. Sadie always liked shadow tails. She said they always looked like they could fly away, anywhere in the world. I don't see what's so great about that. There's no reason ever to leave these woods. She should have known better. November 23rd. It got cold early today. The night seemed to creep up on me. My watch might be broken. I could have sworn it wasn't that late. November 24th. I had a nightmare last night. I think. It had to be a nightmare. Funny how they feel so real sometimes. When I got up to take the dog out, even Buck seemed scared. November 26th. I couldn't go out last night. My leg's still injured. It sounded like it thundered all day yesterday, but it never rained. The rumbling kept me up all night, as if the woods were awake around the cottage and closing in. Feeling better today, I think. November 27th. I lost my scarf while following another sparrow today. I got some good photographs of it. I might replace some of the pictures on the wall in the cottage. November 28th. I'm pretty sure a pack of wolves has migrated into my patch of the woods, out west towards the cemetery. I can hear them at night sometimes. They get closer and closer with each passing night. I hope they pass by soon. Buck has been refusing to go out because of it. Silly dog. They're just wolves. December 1st. Note to self. Cash life insurance check. December 2nd. I went out towards the lake for a change after getting back from the bank. I found my scarf, what was left of it anyway. I think a bear or wolf got to it. I'll wear Sadie's from now on. The dead don't need to keep warm. December 3rd. Note to self. Fix broken windows. December 4th. Snow poured in through the window frames last night. I tried to keep the fire lit, but the damp wood kept throwing up smoke with no flame, like a frozen phantom escaping through the chimney. Buck keeps dragging objects in front of his dog door, like he's boarding up the windows for a storm. He doesn't use the dog doors anymore anyway. I may as well just take it out. December 9th. I finally made it back into the woods to catalogue birds today. I found some pheasant carcasses out by the creek. None of my books say which carnivore tears the hearts from its prey like that. I've been reading up on it all day, poring through every possible page. I'll keep looking. I haven't pulled Sadie's book collection down from the attic in a couple of months. Maybe one of them has the answer. It has to. I need to get them down one of these days anyway. I can make some good money on them when the weather gets a little warmer again. Sadie took good care of those books. December 10th. Still no sign of an answer about the dead pheasants. My bedroom window got broken again while I was sleeping, but I was too busy with my nightmares to notice. Buck barked my ear off in the morning, alerting to the open window that he had spotted a prized bird. I don't know any birds that could break that window. My dog's gone crazy. December 11th. I feel like the snow followed me around today. Maybe I should lay off the Cuervo. Found 6 swallows today down the here near Heartache Cove. One of them wasn't dead when I got there. At least, it was still convulsing. Dead creatures don't convulse. The dead don't move. They can't leave. December 13th. Note to self: go to the pharmacy for bandages. Wear a balaclava to cover the gashes. Look up how to give yourself facial stitches without any painkillers. Get a bone for the dog. December 14th. I might take a few days off bird watching next week. I'm not feeling well. December 22nd. Note to self: pick up groceries in town. It's about to blizzard, and I'll be snowed in for days without any access to the rest of the world. Just the way I like it. December 23rd. I saw something fly through the tops of the trees last night. It didn't look like any bird I've ever seen. It was much, much too large. December 26th. The nightmares don't end when I wake up anymore. They keep coming. They're always coming. December 28th. I'm hungry all the time. I don't know what it is I want, but I want it so badly I can practically feel my stomach trying to tear through my body to get to it. December 30th. I've always wanted to see what the birds see when they fly. Not like I did last night. Not like that. The claws punctured holes in my back. I'm not sure how I'm still alive, but I woke up in the reddened snowbank. December 31st. Note to self: barricade the doors. Find a shovel to bury the dog and what's left of the mailman. Find napkins. Edgar Holloway was reported missing on January 2nd. His body was never recovered. All the police found was a puffy white scarf hung delicately on a tree branch 10 feet off the ground, as if someone was planning to come back for it any minute, next to a pair of binoculars. Thank you for watching this video. It means a lot to me that you made it to the end of it. If you enjoyed my narration, please hit the like button, leave a comment letting me know what you think of it, and if you don't already, go ahead and subscribe to my channel for more creepy storytelling content. I have plans to release tons of new content starting this year. I am working on some true crime stories, videos detailing creatures from different mythologies, some more famous ghost and paranormal stories, and loads more. Again, thank you so much to everyone who is continuing to subscribe to my channel and helping it to grow by watching my content. If you want to support me even further, please consider heading over to my Ko-fi account and purchasing me a coffee. You can also check out my Teespring store and consider purchasing one of my shirt designs.